Well done. Faced with Eamon's praise, Klein forced a smile and politely replied, "Thank you." To be honest, he preferred to hear curses rather than praise, as that meant that he was close to succeeding. Of course, Klein suspected that even if he managed to escape, Eamon wouldn't be flustered and exasperated. Based on the character displayed by this god of mischief, it was very likely that he found it interesting and exciting while also inevitably feeling a little depressed and disappointed to the point of being eager for the next round. It's a huge improvement to be able to think of using door to disrupt me. Eamon smiled indifferently. But don't you think that I'd be in a relatively more vigilant state while door opening? And that it's actually not that easy to be affected by an accident? After some thought, Klein answered seriously, "That's what I thought in the beginning, but later on, I felt that you should be able to grasp my state of mind, believing that I wouldn't dare to act when you opened the door. When that happens, making an attempt might work wonders. Doing it when others believe that you wouldn't do it was also a strategy." In his previous life, Klein had come into contact with games that had such a higher level of thinking that made his head spin. "What if I thought of this level as well?" Eamon said with a smile as he used his knuckle to nudge the bottom of his monocle. At the same time, the remaining marionettes, which were still alive, took out crystal monocles out of thin air and wore them on their right eye. All of them cast their gazes at Klein. This left Klein's scalp tingling. He discovered that the connection between the marionettes and himself had instantly been severed. Although you've improved, failure still demands some level of punishment. With a smile, Eamon turned around and walked towards the cathedral. As he took a step forward, the marionettes revealed smiles one after another as they collapsed to the ground stiffly. This caused Klein's soul to be torn apart again and again as the blood vessels on his forehead visibly bulged. As he endured the pain, he stood rooted to the ground and calmed down after a long while. During this process, although he had always been in the depths of the darkness, he didn't suffer any attacks from the terrifying monsters, nor did he turn into a concealed state. When did Eamon steal the concealment powers in this city? If I had tried to commit suicide, I definitely would have had the thoughts stolen from me. My preparations still aren't enough. I don't have enough confidence when dealing with Eamon, having not considered the things he might have stolen into consideration. I really didn't expect him to release the day that he stole from the ruins of the battlefield of gods. Regarding what else he stole in the past, or whatever he has on him, I have no idea. I can't make targeted preparations. That monocle is some sort of vessel used to store stolen items. Or is it part of Eamon to begin with? So every time he parasitizes someone, a monocle will be taken out. Klein rubbed his temples and walked into the cathedral. Looking at Eamon before the door of light, he asked, seemingly casual, "Why do you have so many monocles? Where do you usually place them?" Eamon stroked the monocle on his right eye and smiled indifferently. "Why don't you ask me why every avatar of mine has eyes? And where do I usually place them?" "I understand." Klein nodded in enlightenment. Eamon cast his gaze back to the door of light that had yet to calm down from the rippling. He casually said, "I have the nagging feeling that this operation of yours is a major preparation piece, and not an attempt. What cheap trick did you pull off during that process?" After some deliberation, Klein replied with a smile, "Guess. I do have some guesses." "Do you think I've guessed it correctly?" Eamon asked with interest as he pinched the edge of his monocle. "Perhaps, or perhaps not." Klein didn't give a clear answer as he cooperatively walked to Eamon's side. He saw him reach out again and press down on the pale white door of light. Above the door of light, ripples appeared once again as they became more intense and exaggerated. After about 10 seconds, the ripples spread the surroundings, causing the door of light to expand twice in size. Eamon glanced at Klein, gesturing for him to take a step forward. Klein instinctively turned his head and looked around the cathedral. Beyonder characteristics left behind by the mutated monsters were shimmering outside the area that the lantern had lit up. They weren't all Beyonders when they were alive. After those ordinary people turned into monsters, a large part of the power came from the darkness and degeneration. The powers didn't belong to them, so no characteristics were purged. I almost forgot. After taking a look together with Klein, Eamon suddenly shook his head and smiled. Just as he finished his sentence, a bunch of Beyonder characteristics floated up and entered his body. They merged with him, leaving only a small portion behind. Most of the people who chose to transform into monsters are of the apprentice pathway, Beyonders and their family members who can enter the city's dark side, Eamon said casually as he retracted his gaze. Even if it's a similar pathways beyond a characteristic, it would be problematic if it's directly eaten, right? Shouldn't it only be possible to jump to a higher level of a neighboring pathway? It also allows the accommodation of lower sequences. Seeing this, Klein was a little stunned as he asked curiously, won't this accumulate madness? This wasn't just a matter of accumulating madness. Klein suspected that if he did it himself, there was a high chance that he would go crazy. Others will, Eamon said with a smile, but not me. A true bug. Klein couldn't help but sigh inwardly. Then, the distance between him and the door of light disappeared. Subconsciously, he forgot about the remaining death pathways beyond the characteristics, and he entered the mutated door of light with Eamon. Endless darkness and squirming lines of light were mixed together, giving rise to the feeling of a sudden descent. About 10 seconds later, he discovered that he and Eamon had appeared on a square. The dim yellow light of the animal hide lantern seemed to be stopped by an invisible force, causing it to only illuminate half the square. Lightning streaked across the sky, illuminating the surroundings. With the help of the lightning, Klein saw several incomplete statues erected around the square. They either had their hands tied to their backs, had their bodies entangled with the thorny roses, or looked like mummies. They gave off the feeling of being restrained. This city first believed in the mutant king. Like a qualified tour guide, Eamon introduced the situation of each scenic site to Klein. They're very interesting. They're usually restrained and quiet, just like ascetics. However, once they encounter prey, or in special moments in time, they will release a bloodthirsty desire to kill. You can imagine that on the night of the full moon, this is a city where werewolves roam. From the looks of it, the mutants originally had the concept of temperance. Later on, it was led astray by the mother tree of desire. Using the new round of lightning, Klein took a few more looks and asked thoughtfully, the mutant king's image is close to that of a mummy. No. Although he is an ugly and twisted man, he likes to entangle himself with thorny roses. Eamon scoffed. Klein took the opportunity to ask, what kind of idols will your believers worship? In mysticism, your symbol is a clock and a worm of time. Eamon scratched his chin and said, in theory, my believers are all me. I don't need to trouble myself with building an idol. My believers are all me. Thankfully, I have a blessed like Danitz now. Klein suddenly realized that he was quite similar to Eamon in certain aspects. Of course, when I say, my believer is myself, it's a funny story. When Eamon says that, my believers are all me, it becomes a horror novel. The difference in style is quite huge. Klein finally mocked himself. As Eamon walked forward, he continued, however, in my father's era, quite a number of people believed in me. Some of them set off with the name, Angel of Time, using the emblem of the clock to construct my idol. Some of them used the title of God of Mischief and used a crow covered in mysterious patterns as my image, while others combined the two together. Having said that, the monocled Eamon suddenly turned his head and glanced at Klein before curling his lips. We're less than 3 days away from our final destination. That is to say, I only have 3 days left. Klein nearly drew in a cold breath of air. The pressure increased rapidly, making him feel as though his nerves were being crushed. He had yet to determine the true purpose behind this game Eamon made, nor did he discover any traces of what he was being driven to do. This meant that he was unable to grasp the key, and he was unable to find a real opportunity to escape. The performance of Eamon's avatar made him understand that he might not even be able to last 10 seconds before him. As his thoughts raced, Klein fell silent. Following that, he walked out of the square covered in ruins. There were few pedestrians on the streets as they came and went in a hurry. In Pritz Harbor, where many houses were covered in bum marks, the chestnut-haired Queen Mystic placed a newspaper on the table. The first page of the Tussock Times was about the king's assassination. It also claimed that the assassin came from Fazak or Intis. This isn't stopping the disaster, nor is it worsening the disaster. Bernadette muttered to herself with a serious expression. She pondered for a moment, picked up the cloth on the table, and wrapped it up. Then, she released her fingers and allowed it to relax. This time, the coffee cups, pens, newspapers, and other items in the tablecloth disappeared. What appeared were ritual items like silver-made candles. Following that, Bernadette held a ritual and summoned Gairman Sparrow's messenger. As a partner, she felt that she needed to ask about the other party's situation and see if there was anything else she needed to help with. The moment the ritual ended, 4 blonde, red-eyed heads walked out of the burgeoning candle flame. Dressed in a dark and complicated long dress, Rionette Tinniker's neck was empty. Bernadette's eyelids twitched indecimably before she picked up the letter and gold coin that she had prepared earlier and handed it to the messenger. One of Rionette Tinniker's heads bit on the letter and gold coin while the other head sized up Queen Mystic for a few seconds. She shifted her gaze back and walked into the void. However, just as Bernadette was about to put away the tablecloth, Miss Messenger suddenly appeared again. One of the 2 heads with blonde hair and red eyes spoke one after another. He has disappeared. Gairman Sparrow has gone missing. Bernadette had a vague sense of foreboding when the abnormally terrifying messenger returned. She had roughly figured out what had happened. Therefore, after hearing the other party's response, her expression sank slightly. There was no obvious reaction. Queen Mystic's blue eyes, which resembled a condensing sea, instantly turned darker. They temporarily lost focus, as though she was looking at a torrent of fate through Rionette Tinniker. 2 to 3 seconds later, Bernadette suddenly closed her eyes, as if a blinding light had appeared in front of her. Blood-red liquid trickled from the corner of her eyes, accentuating her pale face. With her eyes tightly shut, Bernadette said in a slightly ethereal voice, "Gairman Sparrow is in grave danger. Darkness is devouring the light, leaving behind only a sliver of hope." This was a prophecy. The sequence 3 of the mystery prior pathway was clairvoyant. The 4 heads held by Rionette Tinniker spoke one after another. What does darkness symbolize? Bernadette maintained her composure and said, desolation, aberration, apocalypse, negativity, error. Rionette Tinniker, who was wearing a dark and complicated long dress, didn't let the head in her hand speak any further. Throwing down the letter and gold coin, she turned and walked into the void, disappearing into the room. Queen Mystic Bernadette stood rooted to the ground for a few seconds without moving. Finally, she opened her eyes again. Her blue eyes were hazy and lifeless, as though she needed more time to restore her eyesight. Bernadette thought for a moment and reached out her right hand. The tablecloth was stowed away before being spread open once again. The ritual items were replaced with a fountain pen, paper, and ink bottle. The fountain pen suddenly leaped up, as if it was held by an invisible sprite. It quickly wrote down the matter of Gairman Sparrow's disappearance onto the paper. In the captain's cabin of the future. Despite looking at the fried mushrooms on her plate and taking in the fragrance of the fat, Katlia didn't pick up her cutlery for a long time. Suddenly, her spiritual perception was triggered. She turned her head to look at the spot where the brass sextant was placed, and she realized that a letter had appeared there at some point in time. Katlia immediately revealed a smile as she reached out to pick up the letter and eagerly began reading it. Gradually, she frowned. Gairman Sparrow has gone missing. Katlia repeated the key point of the letter in a low voice. She acutely felt that this matter was somewhat serious. She easily understood the meaning behind Queen Mystic's letter. Without any hesitation, she bowed her head, clasped her hands, and recited an honorific name in ancient Hermes, the fool that doesn't belong to this era. Above the grey fog, the crimson star representing the hermit came alive. It began expanding and contracting, spreading out ripples of prayers. They intertwined with the ripples created by the 2 crimson stars that corresponded to the magician and the sun. They surged towards the ancient and majestic palace, like tidal waves. Someone is praying to Mr. Fool again. The echoes are getting even stronger, and the sound is becoming more clear. I can hear it clearly, and the image is also clearer. This prayer seems to be from Ma'am Hermit. Only she likes to wear ancient warlock robes. Queen Mystic discovered that something has happened to Gairman Sparrow. Although I was worried that I would die this time and needed a certain amount of time to revive, I had already hinted to the members of the Tarot Club that I might cancel the gathering next week, but that was just a hint. It wasn't a formal notice, nor was it clear enough. When Monday comes, they'll definitely panic, pray, and try to make contact, only to discover that Mr. Fool has also disappeared. No, he has run off with the world. Klein used a deprecating comment to ease his feelings. He glanced at Eamon, who was walking beside him. Without a word, he lifted the lantern in his hand and said, "It should have been extinguished long ago." Wearing a pointed hat and black mage robe, Eamon nodded slightly and said, "I left it in a magical state. It can maintain its light for a week without needing any fuel." Klein thought for a moment and asked, "Is this the deceiving of natural laws?" Eamon turned his head and used his monocled right eye to look at Klein for a second before smiling. Smart. The error pathways sequence 3 is a more profound version of swindler, known as mentor of deceit. It's about the same as my guess. However, it isn't only the error pathway that can do such a thing. The Black Emperor can use distortion and exploit powers to achieve that. In his mind, Klein began comparing the differences between the Marauder and the lawyer pathway. At this moment, Eamon stroked his chin and asked with interest, "There are less than 3 days left. If you don't think of a way to escape, it will be too late. Do you plan on making a new attempt tomorrow? Make a guess." Klein forced a smile as he answered in the same rhetoric manner that Eamon was best at using. To be honest, he didn't believe that the effects would be better given more attempts. On the one hand, frequent attempts were indeed able to test the limits of Eamon's powers. By expending the items that he had previously stolen, Klein could establish a good foundation for the final battle. But on the other hand, he would also expose his trump cards. After all, he was in a passive state and had no chance to prepare. To force Eamon to showcase more of the means available to him, it required him to use the few trump cards he had. If his countermeasures were all figured out by Eamon after his repeated attempts, he wouldn't have any chance of escaping. An attempt to escape was a double-edged sword. If one wasn't careful, one would cut oneself. It was precisely because of this that Klein didn't blindly take action, and carefully made plans in his heart. As he spoke, he walked out of the city that originally worshipped the mutant king and later believed in the ancient sun god. There were only white bones and several stone structures that had been weathered by the elements here that showcased its former prosperity. Outside the city, there was an endless wilderness that couldn't be seen in the lightning. At 7 Pinster Street, Leonard sat on a sofa. He placed his feet on the coffee table and leisurely flipped through the day's newspaper. Yesterday, George III's death had brought them copious amounts of work. He had spent the entire night on duty, and he received 5 hours of rest today. After sleeping for 2 hours, Leonard woke up in high spirits, attempting to understand the current situation from the normal media. In fact, as the captain of a Red Gloves team, he knew more than the reporters about certain aspects. For example, in the outskirts of Backland, where the Tudor ruin was located, it had collapsed into a rather large lake. It had nearly affected Dwayne Dantes's mega manor. Another was the death of George III, who had self-destructed at the square, but wasn't the actual person. The search for his corpse was to no avail, as though he had vanished into thin air that night. Of course, Leonard was extremely certain that George III was already dead. The eldest prince was about to inherit the title of Balam Emperor and Loan King. Back then, something had happened at Sephira Castle. This matter definitely has something to do with Mr. Fool. Klein had long warned us about George III. The reactions of the 3 churches were very strange. Even the Church of the Lord of Storms, which is most prone to acting rash, wasn't too angry. As Leonard flipped through the newspaper, his thoughts wandered casually. At this moment, his mind was filled with the slightly aged voice of Palais Zoroast. Gehrman Sparrow's messenger is here. Leonard suddenly looked up and saw the angel-level messenger wearing a dark and complicated long dress appear in front of him. The 4 blonde, red-eyed heads held by Rionette Tinnicker spoke one after another. Gehrman Sparrow has encountered extreme danger. He has gone missing. Klein has encountered danger and disappeared. Leonard immediately retracted his legs and stood up. Without waiting for the reminder provided by Palais Zoroast, his spiritual perception stirred as he blurted out, "Is it related to the death of George III?" Yes, he destroyed the apotheosis ritual of George III. The 8 red eyes on Rionette Tinnicker's 4 heads looked at Leonard. Apotheosis ritual. Although Leonard was anxious, he was still shocked by the phrase. For someone to hold an apotheosis ritual, one had to be a sequence 1 angel at the very least. Yet, Klein was able to directly participate in something at that level. Mr. Fool's plan. Leonard's green eyes glimmered slightly. Relying on his relatively rich experience, he pointedly asked, "What happened to Klein the last time you saw him?" The 4 blonde, red-eyed heads of Rionette Tinnicker shook and said, "Possibly, under Zaratul's pursuit." As Gehrman Sparrow's messenger, this ancient bane was able to sense that her employer had also left the Tudor ruins after escaping. And as for those who understood the means of a scholar of yore, they were undoubtedly high-sequence beyonders of the same pathway. Therefore, Zaratul would definitely be able to obstruct and pursue him. Zaratul, the leader of the secret order, the sequence 1 angel, Zaratul. As Leonard was worried about Klein, he felt fear and concern for the life of his former colleague. At that moment, a deep voice sounded in his mind: "Ask her what other clues she has." Leonard immediately did as he was asked. Rionette Tineke seemed to know that Leonard wasn't simple. She repeated Queen Mystic's prophecy word by word. After listening to what was said, Palais Zoroast fell silent for a while before sighing. "Error, I think I know about your former colleague's current situation." Leonard subconsciously wanted to ask, but because there were outsiders around, he held back his urge. Palais paused and continued. The anomaly with Sephira Castle attracted Zaratul. How could Aemon not notice it? This should be related to the struggle for Sephira Castle. Sephira Castle. Leonard slowly took a deep breath and said to Rionette Tineke, he might have fallen into the hands of Aemon. After Miss Messenger's four heads nodded and turned to leave, Leonard immediately sat down and clasped his hands. Closing his eyes, he prayed. The fool that doesn't belong to this era. Above the grey fog, the crimson star representing the star also burgeoned and contracted. The rippling light gradually overlapped with the other ripples created by the other three crimson stars, turning into a tidal wave that surged through the entire mysterious space, causing the space to vibrate slightly. After describing the matter related to Klein, Leonard ended his prayers and waited for Mr. Fool to respond. However, he still didn't receive any feedback after nearly 15 minutes. Mr. Fool has always been very responsive. Leonard couldn't help but mutter. After a few seconds of silence, Palais Zoroast reminded with a slightly aged voice, "Recall what the fool said recently." Leonard thought carefully and slowly said, "In the middle of the week, he reminded us not to head into the woods in the northwestern outskirts of Backland. Yes, he seemed to hint that the gathering might not be held as planned. Read latest chapters at wusharworld.eu, as expected." Palais Zoroast let out a long sigh and said, "The fool had predicted Aemon's appearance to a certain extent. They might be fighting in different domains now. One of them wishes to hold on to Sephira Castle, while the other wishes to become the new owner of Sephira Castle. Your former colleague has unfortunately been embroiled in this matter. Mr. Fool had expected this. Is this a trap he laid for Aemon?" Leonard's green eyes lit up as he blurted out. Palais spent a significant amount of time thinking as he spoke much slower. Perhaps that's the case. Perhaps it's because Aemon exploited the trap and took the initiative. Don't underestimate a blasphemer, a powerful king of angels. According to what Leonard knew, Mr. Fool was either the owner of the Sephira Castle who was slowly recovering, corresponding to some unknown deity in history, or he was the embodiment of Sephiro. Currently, he was unable to control his authority and strength very well, something that could be fixed with a further qualitative change. And regardless of the possibilities, Mr. Fool was still unable to reach the level of a true deity. He was likely on the same level as the King of Angels. Under such circumstances, it was rather normal that Mr. Fool and the terrifying blasphemer would undergo an intense battle. After all, that person was one of them, one of the strongest hidden existences beneath the deities. He was even more powerful than the hidden sage that was usually categorized as an evil god. Even deities were somewhat apprehensive towards him. Leonard couldn't help but tense up. He asked in a low voice worriedly, "Old man, do you have any way to provide any help? Isn't Aemon your greatest enemy? Such help might be limited, but it should be able to pull Klein out of the maelstrom." Upon hearing that, Palais Zoroast laughed and said with an obvious self-deprecating tone, "Aren't you expecting too much from me? Indeed, if Aemon obtains Sephira Castle, I'll definitely die at his hands. I might not be able to survive this winter. And if Sephira Castle is left with the fool, I might have a chance of surviving in the future. But would an old man like me, who has just recovered to Sequence 2, have the ability to interfere with a battle at this level? Even if I were to use the yesterday once more charms, what can I do in the short time span of 2 to 3 seconds? Yes. At the critical moment, I might be able to help the fool warp the situation, but I don't even know where they are fighting. How can I seize the opportunity?" Leonard fell silent after hearing Old Man's long answer. He immediately bowed his head and raised his hands to press them against the sides of his head. He muttered to himself, "Don't tell me that I can only watch helplessly." Palais sighed and said, "Be patient. All we can do now is be patient." The Fool and Evermight, and some other deities and kings of angels seem to have some tacit understanding with each other. They might even be cooperating with one another. They will not allow Aemon to take away Sephira Castle. Wait patiently. Perhaps it won't take long for a window of opportunity to appear. Leonard straightened his body and leaned back. He took a deep breath and exhaled. I understand. The Blue Avenger, which had been ordered by the Church of the Lord of Storms to attack the port and phasation merchant ships near the waters of Sonia Island, was hiding somewhere outside the safe sea route. Alger Wilson stood behind the window of the captain's cabin, using his extremely distant vision to stare at the long coastline. To this, newly advanced, ocean songster's point of view, many captains who received similar missions were the cream of the crop of the mid-sequence Beyonders. The joint operation would definitely be able to effectively harm the traffic flow of phasation waters. This also meant that an attack from Phasac would be reasonably fierce, with a high chance of a Sequence 4 demigod leading the attack. Of course, one couldn't eliminate the possibility of a Sequence 3 War Bishop or Silver Knight appearing. This was a dangerous development for Alger. He didn't wish to put himself in such danger. At the same time, his crew, colleagues, and partners would monitor each other, preventing anyone from deserting. If Alger were to skive and walk on the edge of danger, it wouldn't take long for him to consider killing most of the crew members and become a true pirate, or lose the Blue Avenger and return to Parsu Island for an internal probe. After this operation ends, the captains who could still survive wouldn't exceed a third. Alger calmly analyzed the situation and quickly came up with a plan to avoid danger. That was to participate in the operation, but not take center stage. Alger planned on using a surprise attack on the port while his brethren frenetically attacked the phasation merchant and supply ships. This would bring the people on board his ship onto Sonia Island, allowing them to lay in ambush in a primeval forest. Occasionally, he would cause some minor disturbances to the port which were easily managed. This way, the Phasac demigods would definitely cast their gazes at the sea, and not towards him. At the same time, in the eyes of the crew, he would be a role model who was willing to take great risks to enter the enemy's borders. After thinking through all the details, Alger immediately gathered the crew and repeated his plans. Finally, he emphasized, "This will be very dangerous. Trust me, it's very, very dangerous. We won't be able to advance and retreat like we can at sea. We might be surrounded by enemies at any time, but such an attack will definitely exceed the expectations of the Phasacians, and it will give us the outcome we want. Are you willing to remain on the ship as cowards, or do you want to follow me into battle as a hero to show your devotion to the Lord?" The crew members felt their blood boiling as they rashly said, "FCK the Phasacians." Very good. Alger felt relieved as he struck his right fist on his left breast. "May the storm be with us. May the storm be with us," the sailors saluted and shouted. After making the necessary arrangements, Alger believed that he needed to borrow the unshadowed crucifix as soon as possible so as to purge the excess ocean songsters beyond a characteristic. Although he had exaggerated the danger of landing on the island, there was still a certain level of danger involved. Therefore, he wanted to quickly recover to his optimal condition. And he had long understood Mr. Fool's earlier hint. He felt that tonight or tomorrow morning, Mr. Fool would officially inform them that the gathering was to be cancelled. Of course, there were some ideas in the deepest depths of Alger's heart. He suspected that every time Mr. Fool cancelled the Tarot Club, something had happened to him. He wanted to use this prayer to test if this mighty existence was still normal. "No, I can't. Thou shalt not test God. This isn't a test. Mr. Fool didn't hint that I can't pray to him recently. Besides, borrowing the unshadowed crucifix is something I really need to do within the next few days." Alger paced back and forth, unable to make a decision. At this moment, he heard the sound of waves crashing. Through the additional type of vision provided by the ghost ship, he saw the water part as a huge fish-type creature appeared. The strange-looking giant fish opened its mouth and spat out a small metal ball that landed on the deck. Alger nodded and expressed his gratitude with his singing. This was a sea creature that the Church of the Lord of Storms had tamed. In this operation, it and its companions were the messengers between the various ships and the islands. Upon receiving his gratitude, the giant fish-like creature trembled. With a flick of its tail, it headed deep into the sea and swam into the distance. Alger looked at it silently for 2 seconds before summoning a gust of wind to bring the metal ball into the captain's cabin. He twisted open the metal ball and took out the piece of paper inside. Alger's eyes froze from a mere glance at it. "George III has been assassinated." Alger repeated the content with a heavy expression before recalling the World Gairman Sparrow's reminder and Mr. Fool's hints. This time, he no longer hesitated. He locked the room and softly muttered the honorific name, "The Fool that doesn't belong to this era." These prayers are almost becoming a choral symphony. Mr. Hanged Man wants to borrow the unshadowed crucifix from Little Son. Leonard. Yes. These voices are stacked over one another, undulating in pitch and volume. It's making the surroundings tremble. Klein rubbed his temples, having a feeling that he had been struck by lightning from every direction. At this moment, he followed Eamon deeper into the desolate moors and saw the grayish-yellow fog that blanketed the area. There were a few ravines, and in the deep, dark depths, there were plenty of things roaming. Compared to the quiet, lurking monsters from before, the ones here were rather special. The pointy-hatted Eamon raised his hand to nudge his monocle and pointed ahead with a smile. Another half a day and we should be reaching our final destination. Half a day. It hasn't been a day yet. Didn't you say 3 days? Klein's pupils seemingly dilated. Eamon smiled and said, I said not more than 3 days. 1 day is not more than 3 days, too. Upon saying that, the King of Angels paused and asked with piqued interest, did I hamper your arrangements? Are you feeling more despair? Klein didn't answer as he suddenly reached out his hand and grabbed into the void beside him. Although Klein had been a Beyonder for less than 2 years, his experience could be described as rich and exciting, even among Sequence 4 and Sequence 3 saints. The things he possessed or encountered before that could be summoned from the historical void, and the ones that were capable of quickly killing him didn't number many. Here, he chose the Flaring Sun charm that he had used in Tingen City. He had already recited the incantation, injected his spirituality into it, and was about to activate the charms. Indeed, to a demigod of the seer pathway that meant bizarreness and change, it wasn't very effective against him. He mainly depended on the damage it did to his body, but Klein didn't dodge or defend himself. Instead, he released his body and mind to embrace the light of hope. Even at the level of a Sequence 3 scholar of yore, the defense of a seer pathway's Beyonder remained low. His offensive ability was also equally insufficient compared to his peers. This resulted in a sad fact: when Klein wanted to commit suicide, he didn't have any powers that could quickly kill himself. After all, it was impossible for him to control his spirit-body threads and transform himself into his marionette. This would result in logical contradictions. Towards the end of the process, he would lack the ability to continue making himself a marionette. And when he was searching for ways to kill himself through external means, he realized that, as long as he didn't use methods like marionette interchange, paper figurine substitutes, and historical void hiding, there were too many options that he could consider. The seer was such a powerful pathway that veered towards the extremes. Seeing that Klein was about to take out a Flaring Sun charm from the fog of history, along with having a strong desire to commit suicide, Eamon only smiled. Without even raising his hand, he stole the entire idea, causing the crystal monocle to glow slightly. Klein immediately forgot what he was trying to do. But his actions didn't stop. His shocked reaction when he heard that they were only half a day away from the final destination was mostly faked. This was because he had always been wary of the god of deceit. He didn't trust anything that he said. There were too many interpretations of not more than 3 days, so Klein had long prepared for the worst. After hearing what Eamon said, he immediately arranged the things he needed to do into a sequence. After having the idea of summoning the Flaring Sun charm to commit suicide, it was to summon that existence, summon this, that, and those existences. He made it cyclic, hoping that no matter how many thoughts Eamon stole from him, he would still follow his original plan and perform the corresponding actions. Regarding this matter, back when he dealt with 008, he had been thinking about it above the grey fog. He had used the experience of treating the real him as a marionette and only following a predetermined set of actions. This helped him greatly. At that moment, although he didn't know what he was trying to do, to the point of not realizing that he had forgotten something, he knew very well what he would do next. The past wasn't important, but the present and future were key. Klein reached out his palm again and grabbed the void in front of him. His entire arm sank. However, when he retracted his right hand, nothing came out. At the same time, Eamon raised his palm and gently swiped forward. He had stolen the historical void projection that Klein had summoned. A figure quickly appeared beside Eamon. It was an elder dressed in a hooded black robe. His eyes were deep black, like a dark water surface, and the white beard around his mouth was long and dense. Zaratul, the leader of the secret order, the Sequence 1 angel, Zaratul. The existence that Klein had attempted to summon was actually Zaratul, and he had succeeded in one try. This was because he had made preparations in advance. Back in the city that the Phoenix Believers had built, when Klein had split his marionettes into 3 groups, he was actually attempting to summon Zaratul from the historical void. Without a doubt, it was impossible to succeed at that time. However, as a scholar of yore, it would be a massive failure if one failed to notice that someone else was trying to summon their historical projection. As for Zaratul, he was definitely a senior, excellent, and experienced scholar of yore. After such a failed summoning, Klein had established a connection with Zaratul. This was the tacit understanding between scholars of yore. As for a miracle invoker, an attendant of mysteries, he was able to respond to his historical projection. It was just like how a scholar of yore had a 100% chance of success when borrowing strength from his past. In addition, a scholar of yore had no contractual connection with the historical void projection. They relied on the other party's lack of intelligence, or them having good relationships with them, to control it. And in this world, the few high-level existences most unwilling to see Aemon obtain Sephira Castle was Mr. Daw, followed by Palais, and then Zaratul. In other words, the two of them were short-term allies when it came to resisting Aemon. Due to these factors, Klein believed that he could summon Zaratul in one go. And the facts proved that he was right. And it was precisely because of this that he wasn't worried at all that Aemon would steal away his historical projection that he had summoned. He even hoped that the Angel of Time would do so. As for the reason why he first came up with the idea of committing suicide before summoning Zaratul, it was to let Aemon steal his thoughts. And for Aemon, he would be happy to try since he was a king of angels in search of excitement. With too many choices for him to choose from, it was unlikely he would repeat another thought usurpation. It might be the theft of a historical void projection. This was one of the few trump cards that Klein had. In the next second, Zaratul's gaze turned from a glazed one to a spirited and real one. Clearly, this attendant of mysteries, a senior scholar of yore, had entered the historical void and allowed his projection from the same era to receive his consciousness. And having his own consciousness meant that Zaratul's projection didn't hesitate at all to firmly cast his gaze at Aemon. The eyes of Aemon, the ones wearing and not wearing the monocle, narrowed at the same time. He saw the lightning around him increase in frequency as the vast wilderness with many ravines instantly turned empty and dark. They were speckled with twinkling stars. He had apparently been pulled beneath the cosmos by Zaratul. This was a miracle. As for the projection opposite of Aemon, it had already transformed into a gigantic, mysterious whirlpool formed by squirming Mysterious. They extended out in all directions with transparent tentacles. Just looking at them would make humans lose their minds and turn crazy. At that moment, Klein abandoned the other thoughts in the queue. He took the opportunity to control a monster deep in the darkness and transform it into his marionette. Immediately following that, he switched places with his marionette. After coming to the depths of the darkness, Klein reached out his hand once again to grab at the air in front of him a few times in succession. His marionette did the same action as well. Finally, he dragged a new figure out of the void. It was a figure dressed in a simple linen robe, with a tree bark as a belt. Standing there, barefooted with long, black hair, Ariana's facial features were ordinary and her eyes dark and cold. The Evernite Cloister's matron, the ascetic leader, the servant of concealment, the grounded angel, Ariana. As soon as Ariana appeared, her dark eyes turned normal. She didn't look like a projection at all. Her true body seemed to have entered a concealed state, allowing the summoned historical void projection to also possess intelligence. This was also one of the reasons why Klein had chosen to summon her, and had given up on summoning Mr. Azek and Miss Messenger, who gave him a higher success rate. This way, even if an accident happened during his suicide, preventing his success, there was still a chance to fight Aemon in the subsequent battle. After a historical void's projection possessed their own consciousness, it made it much easier for Klein to maintain them. This resulted in an extension in time for the maintenance of the projection. Following that, he used the connection between the Scholar of Yore and their summoned historical void projection, quickly communicating to Servant of Concealment, Ariana, his intent to kill him. Ariana suddenly bent her body, and her right hand reached behind her back. She pulled out a bone sword covered in strange patterns from the depths of the darkness. Then, she suddenly took a step forward and swung her sword forward. The entire darkness literally stirred as it wildly spread towards where the spot Klein was standing. An unlucky monster happened to be situated between the two of them as it melted away when drowned by the tide of darkness. This wasn't the authority of concealment. This was a combination of repose and horror. It symbolized danger in the darkness, a symbol of silent destruction and vanquishment. The Beyonders of the Sleepless Pathway had to reach Sequence 3 Horror Bishop to grasp such powers. Subconsciously, Klein's survival instinct made him attempt to escape. But at that moment, he felt that the surrounding darkness was an enemy. If he was infected by that force, he would become a part of the tide. There was no avoiding it. There's no need to use all your strength. You can easily kill me with just a portion of your strength. Klein restrained his primal instincts, and he stood on the spot, waiting for the destruction to sweep through him. At that moment, a distant, illusory bell sounded. It was as if it had traveled through a long stretch of history, causing everything around it to slow down, including the surging darkness. In midair, swaths of darkness were pierced, revealing a gigantic wall clock carved out of stone. It was ancient and mottled, and its surface was separated into 12 segments by grayish-white and bluish-black colors. Each segment had different symbols, and the needle had a total of 3 hands, short, medium, long. It seemed to be formed from the 12 rings of a worm of time. As the second hand ticked, the bell rang again. Gong! As the sound echoed, the surging darkness like a tide slowed down even more. Then, the ancient clock's projection dissipated, turning back into Eamon with his pointed hat and monocle. Behind him, the projection of Zaratul was also in a sluggish state. Right on the heels of that, Eamon levitated in midair, extending his right hand, and he pressed down at the darkness. The darkness quickly returned to normal, drowning Klein without causing him any damage. It was unknown if there was a bug or if a Beyonder effect had been stolen. At the same time, Eamon's body instantly became abnormally huge. It was nearly 20 meters tall, but none of his clothes suffered any damage. He looked down at Klein and raised his hand to adjust his monocle. He ignored the attacks from the Zaratul projection behind him, as he curled his lips and said with deep interest, "Interesting." As Eamon spoke, the transparent tentacles covered with mysterious patterns extended out from the gigantic vortex behind his back, and they wrapped around his many different spirit body threads. In the blink of an eye, the illusory black threads were lifted up without any resistance. And with that, one strange monster after another was hoisted up in the air, like ham waiting to be dry-aged. The spirit body threads beside Eamon were all stolen by him, at some point in time. While Zaratul launched his attack, his other slippery tentacle kept extending into the void, attempting to pull something back. In just a few seconds, a figure quickly appeared. He had long chestnut-colored curly hair, blue eyes, high nose bridge, thin lips, and a very beautifully manicured mustache. He wore a dark red coat with rusted golden threads. It was none other than the former Emperor of Intis, Rosel Gustaf. The moment this knowledge emperor stepped into the real world, he looked down at the gigantified Eamon, and complicated and illusory symbols instantly formed in his eyes. He wasn't worried that Eamon would steal his attack at all, because he had prepared an extremely large amount of useless miscellaneous knowledge. Be it the forceful injection or Eamon's theft of it, he could achieve the goal of blowing up the other party's mind. Just as Emperor Rosel's projection was fully formed, another figure appeared from Zaratul's transparent tentacles. The figure had a young face, but his long hair was already half white, pulled back and flailing in the air. In the darkness, half of it was hidden, and the other was prominent. This was an angel that Klein didn't know. He looked like a man with eyes that were dark and filled with the vicissitudes of life. His facial features were considered pretty good, but there was a bunch of thick, short black hair on his cheeks. He emitted the feeling that he was both old and youthful, both rational and crazy. Read more at L. Snovel. He immediately transformed into a cluster of squirming worms that extended out transparent, smooth tentacles akin to Zaratul's projection. Clearly, this was also an angel from the Seer pathway. At that moment, Klein didn't even dare to look straight at the situation occurring in midair. However, when his spiritual perception triggered, he had already sensed something familiar. The second angel that was summoned by Zaratul was the son of an ancient god, the original ancestor of the Antigonus family. This was the historical projection, him, before he became the half-fool. Clearly, Zaratul had made sufficient preparations in this period of time. As Antigonus displayed his complete mythical creature form, the surrounding environment changed once again. The darkness became even darker, as though it had a life of its own as it surged towards the massive manifestation of the classic black-robed, pointy-hatted, and monocled Eamon. In the area enveloped by darkness, all the monsters instantly turned into marionettes. Antigonus seemed to have moved a portion of the ancient divine kingdom from his memories into the real world, so as to separate Aemon from Klein. This was also a miracle. When the miracle happened, Zarathul's transparent tentacles pulled out a third projection from the fog of history. This was a knight in full black armor. He was a demigod from the Fourth Epoch's Solomon Empire, and had not left an illustrious name in history. However, he had another identity. He was a member of the Red of War army, and the leader of this army was King of Angels, Medici. In this division, every member could connect with Red Angel Medici's mind and become one. Read more at L. Snovel. In other words, if Medici could converge their powers, then they too could also transmit their own powers to the collective pool. The powers of a scholar of your powers couldn't summon anything associated with the uniqueness. Even if they were to raise their sequence and receive a qualitative change, it remained the same. However, there was no doubt that seers would seek ways to push the envelope by attempting to bypass the restrictions and obtain help from the uniqueness to a certain extent. Klein had summoned the goddess's descent vessel to accomplish this point, while Zarathul summoned a powerhouse of the Red of War army. At this moment, that projection was equivalent to a portion of Medici. The knight in black armor stepped onto the battlefield. He scanned the battlefield in a sluggish manner before laughing out loud. "Yo, Lil, Raven, have those feathers I burnt recovered?" Due to the fact that his historical projection had summoned another 3 angel-level historical projections, Klein suspected that he couldn't maintain it for 10 seconds. If it wasn't for this change, then he would most likely have felt that he had found a way to indefinitely increase his combat strength. That was to summon 2 angels and 1 projection of himself every time. Then, he could use his projection to summon 2 angels and himself again. If this continued, he would have an infinite number of projections available. At that moment, the ascetic leader of the Church of Evernite, Ariana's body faded and entered a concealed state. Following that, she suddenly appeared behind the gigantified Aemon, slashing out with the bone sword that was covered in strange patterns. Taking advantage of the opportunity when Aemon was being attacked by the 5 angel projections attack, Klein kept converting monsters into his marionettes, getting them to aim at him. He opened his mouth and let out a bang. Air cannons whistled towards him. At the same time, Klein stretched out his hand and easily took out a flaring sun charm that had already been activated and was just short of releasing its effects. He didn't believe that he would be able to survive such repeated attacks. Amidst the booms, Klein suddenly heard a tick-tock noise. The entire world seemed to stop for a moment before it returned to normal. Following that, he saw a huge hole in the dark sky. A ray of pure hot sunlight shone in and lit a golden charm. It was the flaring sun charm. It had turned into a huge ball of light that was engulfed by countless balls of flames. However, the target it attacked wasn't Klein. It had made an error and, instead, wrapped around the Red of War demigod. Meanwhile, the vast amount of knowledge that Roselle Gustave had injected, the miracle created by Antigonus, the destructive sword which Ariana had swung out, the transparent tentacles that Zarathul extended, they all pointed at the same target in an erroneous manner, Medici's black-armored subordinate. At some point, the projection that consisted of a part of Medici's will first suffered an explosion in his mind. Even his instinctive reactions seemed to have disappeared. Then, he was assaulted by the barrage of heavy attacks, and quickly dissipated in midair. Wearing a pointed hat and a classical mage robe, it was unknown when Aemon had returned to the size of a human and landed at the bottom of the battlefield. He raised his right hand and adjusted the crystal monocle as a beam of light lit up. Behind his back, the ancient mottled clock phantom appeared once again. The longest second hand quickly spun half around at an extraordinary speed. It took less than a second, but everything on the desolate moors seemed to have lost 10 to 20 seconds. The projection of Antigonus's historical projection disappeared. Following that, Roselle's historical projection faded away. Finally, it was the historical projections of Zarathul and Ariana. The amount of time they could be maintained had been stolen. Klein, who was just about to commit suicide for the 3rd time, couldn't believe his eyes. He had expected blasphemer Aemon to resolve the 5 angel projections. After all, they were merely projections. A projection was much weaker than the actual body. However, Klein never expected the other party to be so casual about it that he didn't even have a chance to commit suicide. He had used his trump card in exchange for such an outcome. It was inevitable for him to feel disheartened and despair. Eamon nudged his monocle and took a step forward to appear in front of him. He smiled. If they were all the true bodies, it would indeed be more troublesome. However, the historical void projection has a very huge flaw. And grasping the problem of something is what I'm best at. Looking at this angel of time whose smile remained the same while his expression was one of delight, as though he hadn't been in a difficult situation just now, Klein's heart slowly sank, as if he had fallen into an abyss. His spiritual perception was triggered as scenes quickly flashed through his mind. After entering the forsaken land of the gods, Eamon changed his clothes, going from a dark-colored jacket, trousers, and black top hat that met the aesthetic standards of modern times to a classic mage's robe and a pointed hat. After that, he suggested a game of escaping and obstructing. He appeared extremely confident and wasn't worried about any mishaps. As his thoughts raced, Klein's throat turned dry, and he said in a low and hoarse voice, "You are the true body. After entering the forsaken land of the gods, your true body merged with your avatar." He seriously suspected that the person in front of him was Eamon's true body, the true blasphemer, the whole king of angels. The corners of the monocled Eamon's mouth curled up bit by bit. "This is very interesting, isn't it? The expression on your face after knowing the truth is what I wanted to see in this game." He had clearly admitted that he was the main body. He was born accommodating the uniqueness of the Marauder pathway. He was peerless amongst the ranks of those beneath that of deities. This meant that, unless a true deity descended, no matter how hard Klein struggled, he wouldn't be able to escape from Eamon's hands. And this was the forsaken land of the gods. The only active deity was the true creator, and he wasn't too interested in Sephira Castle. Although he had suspected that the Eamon beside him had swapped with his actual body, Klein, who had experienced countless instances of hope, only to have them destroyed, experienced what was the ultimate sense of despair when he was truly certain of it. If it wasn't for the fact that the Tarot Club involved Miss Justice, Leonard, and company, as well as how he knew that Eamon was best at deception, he would have admitted defeat and expressed his willingness to become his blessed. Isn't it normal to join the ranks of the opponents if you can't beat them? As he lampooned, a thought suddenly flashed through his mind. He recalled the words that Eamon had previously said. His eyes lit up, and he completely calmed down. Looking at Eamon, he leisurely stretched his body and said with a smile, "Kill me." Lightning once again lit up the desolate moors that were blanketed with grayish-yellow fog. It illuminated the spot where an angel-level battle had just happened, illuminating the calm smile on his face. Eamon looked at him for a few seconds before nudging his monocle and smiling. "Can't you say something else? You seem to have found new hope." Klein's smile didn't change as he clenched his fist to his nose and stuck one hand into his pocket. "I just suddenly understood something. It turns out that it's not too demoralizing to play this game with your true body. On the contrary, this shows that you have no way of stealing my destiny." "Oh." Eamon smiled as he spoke in a tone, as though he was looking forward to what Klein would say next. Klein laughed and said without any hesitation, "Otherwise, once I entered the forsaken land of the gods, you would have directly stolen my destiny and become the new owner of Sephira Castle. Even if you want to play a game of escaping and obstructing, you could have waited until the main goal was achieved before doing so. That way, you wouldn't be taking any risks. And having lost my chance to resurrect and my original destiny, I'll put in an even greater effort into escaping due to my instinct to survive. Indeed, the god of mischief might do something that disregards danger, doing so in pursuit of excitement, but you're still the god of deceit." Having said that, Klein looked at the unperturbed expression on Eamon's face and paused. "I know that you really have the ability to steal the destinies of others, but being capable of doing something doesn't mean that you'll do it. This requires a risk assessment, as well as weighing and analyzing the pros and cons. I believe that you don't wish to steal my destiny directly. That will make you bear the burden of everything brought about by Sephira Castle. You have to resist the trauma of the resurrection of its original owner. Even for a king of angels like you, this is also very dangerous. If you aren't careful, you can perish. Therefore, you want to find a loophole, you want to get Sephira Castle without suffering the negative effects. And this requires my permission." When he said that, Klein thought of the experience of getting hit by computer viruses in his previous life. Those viruses would always pretend to be normal and cheat him into giving him permission. This was somewhat similar to the current situation. After hearing Klein's words, Eamon looked at him without a word. Instead, he calmly adjusted the crystal monocle. Klein smiled and continued, "From the moment you parasitized me, you've been setting up a huge scam. On the one hand, you've given me the option of becoming your blessed, telling me that your true body can withstand my destiny, causing me to bear a heavy psychological burden. In the subsequent journey, you constantly made me see hope before destroying it. From time to time, you'll give me a time limit, making me unknowingly seize an opportunity and catch my breath. Then, you suddenly shortened the trip, disrupting my plans. Finally, you reveal the card that you're the true body, sending me into the abyss of despair, so as to destroy my will and dismantle my mental defenses. I would completely break down and choose to become your blessed, and agree to that hidden transaction." After hearing everything in silence, Eamon suddenly laughed and raised his hands to gently clap. "Perfect deduction. However, you seem to have missed a problem. What I said was to see my real body at a sufficiently safe place. Then, your destiny will be taken away. Now that we haven't reached our final destination, I naturally won't take the risk." Klein's expression sank slightly before he relaxed again. "I'm looking forward to how different the developments will be there," he responded to Eamon in his style. The genuine King of Angels adjusted his monocle and pointed to the side with a smile. "Soon. We'll arrive in less than half a day." "How long is that exactly?" Klein instinctively lacked trust in Eamon's vague descriptions. Eamon scratched his chin and chuckled. "Half an hour." Klein turned his head to look in the direction where Eamon had pointed. He only saw deep darkness, nothing else. A bolt of lightning streaked across the desolate moors, but even farther away was a thick grayish-yellow fog. Backland, Empress Borough, in the Hall family's luxurious villa. After 2 days of chaos, Audrey's life finally regained some peace. This made her even more curious about the truth behind the king's assassination. Considering how Mr. Fool had seemingly hinted that the tarot gathering would be cancelled today, Audrey decided to pray to this existence in advance and establish a connection with the world Gehrman Sparrow to figure out the corresponding situation. The moment she glanced at Susie, the golden retriever immediately walked out of the room, closed the door with her leg in passing, and sat outside. Audrey sat down, took on a prayer pose, and recited in ancient Hermes, "The fool that doesn't belong to this era." Backland East Borough, inside a 2-bedroom rental apartment. "Do you think there will be a gathering today?" "There's no formal notice." Fols took out her pocket watch for women and opened it. Zio shook her head. "I don't know." Fols couldn't sit still any longer. She left her seat and paced back and forth anxiously as she muttered to herself. Mr. World didn't respond, neither did Mr. Fool respond. As she spoke, Fols suddenly looked at her friend who was eating some ham. She hurriedly said, "Zio, why don't you try praying to Mr. Fool and ask if the gathering will be held as scheduled today?" Zio frowned slightly as she put down her fork and nodded. "Okay." She also found the situation a little strange. She clasped her hands and held them under her chin. Zio took a deep breath and said in a low voice, "The fool that doesn't belong to this era." Backland, North Borough, underground of St. Samuel Cathedral, in a room behind Cheney's Gate. Emlyn White woke up, feeling puzzled over the dream he had. He had apparently dreamed of the sanguine ancestor, Lilith. In his dream, he was trapped in a castle covered in red grapevines, one he couldn't escape from no matter how hard he tried. Later, through a narrow window from high above, he saw the crimson moon outside and a pair of bat wings that covered half the crimson moon. In the legends of the Sanguine, this was one of the symbols of the ancient goddess, Lilith. Right on the heels of that, Emlyn flew up high in excitement, attempting to open the narrow window. At the bottom of the glass, he found a tarot card. On the surface of the tarot card was a lad dressed in gorgeous clothes. He was wearing splendid headgear with a stick over his shoulder. There was a bindle hanging on the end of the stick, and a puppy was following behind him. The Fool card. At this point in his dream, Emlyn naturally woke up. As a sanguine viscount, he had the ability to perform a basic analysis of dreams. It must be because of my current situation that this dream appeared. That star actually didn't deliver any human blood to me. I am indeed the target of the ancestors' benediction. She is hinting to me that if I wish to escape from my predicament, I have to obtain help from Mr. Fool. What day is it today? Forget it, I'll just pray. That way, I can leave as soon as possible. Emlyn sat up with hope as he piously chanted, "The fool that doesn't belong to this era." Above the grey fog, the 3 crimson stars that corresponded to justice, judgment, and the moon began to expand and shrink, emitting light to create ripples. They merged into the dark red tide that originally existed, causing the shock waves in the mysterious space to instantly intensify. Amidst the quake, the tide flooded the ancient and majestic palace, lighting up one mysterious symbol after another behind the 8 seats on the long bronze table. This brought a new halo and resonance, accompanied by a buzzing sound. At the end of the long, mottled table, the back of the fool's seat lit up as well. The complicated symbol formed by the contorted lines and pupil-less eye kept extending outwards, becoming layered and extremely three-dimensional. The dark red tide was attracted over and formed a figure on the high back chair belonging to the fool. This figure wasn't stable enough. It distorted and scattered from time to time, hardly capable of maintaining its form. On a desolate moor covered with grayish-yellow fog, Klein paused for a moment and looked up at the lightning that streaked across the sky. He then retracted his gaze. Holding the lantern in his hand, he followed beside Aemon, deep into the endless moors. The more the man and the king of angels proceeded, the more ravines the ground had. Similarly, their depths became more and more exaggerated. About 10 minutes later, another bolt of lightning streaked across the sky. Not far away, Klein saw a single-eyed giant with a bluish-black pupil, pacing back and forth. It towered tens of meters. His body was covered in traces of rotting pus. His eye was sunken and lifeless. It was obvious that he was dead. However, he continued wandering around. Grayish-yellow gas emanated from his body, interweaving in midair to create the fog over the moor. The grayish-yellow fog that enveloped the vast moor was actually generated by this bluish-black giant. The youngest son of the giant King Ormir, the god of glory, Bladel. He publicly cursed my father and was punished to forever roam this area. Of course, he has long died in the cataclysm, but he still wasn't able to free himself. Aemon looked at the giant and smiled. If I hadn't stolen the corresponding damage dealt to you, you would have been contaminated by the fog created after Bladel's death. You would become a cursed entity that roams this area. Do I have to thank you? Suddenly, Klein felt like he had entered a myth. With him in tow, Aemon continued forward. Soon, they approached the bluish-black, single-eyed giant. There was an extremely deep ravine on the spot where the giant was loitering about. As the lightning flashed, a thick and vast grayish-white building appeared at the bottom. With just a glance, Klein's eyelids twitched slightly as he recalled the scene he saw when he was divining the unshadowed crucifix. If he remembered correctly, this should be where the ancient sun god, the City of Silver's creator, Aemon and Adam's father walked out from. Is this the safe place that Aemon mentioned? Klein's heart sank. At this moment, the pointy-hatted, monocled Aemon walked to the edge of the ravine. With his back facing the grayish-white building, he spread his arms slightly and said with a smile, "This is the holy land where my father was awoken. Buried in it is the history I wish to seek. My father told me that this place has an ancient name, called..." As a streak of silver lightning tore through the sky, the black-robed Aemon paused as he widened his arms, saying with a solemn tone, "Chernobyl. Chernobyl." Upon hearing Aemon's words, Klein's first reaction was one of shock. Back when they were approaching the bluish-black, single-eyed giant, he had come up with many possibilities, but he never expected to hear such a name. This was akin to seeing a machine gun appear in an ancient oil painting, or a novel's plot appearing in a scientific paper. It was filled with unbelievable contradictions. In the next second, he thought of the funny matter about how the ancient sun god had used his rib to create Dark Angel Sasria, but had named his eldest son Adam. He instinctively believed that the current situation was similar, and he couldn't help but laugh. To have Aemon, who was so powerful that he was almost a bug in the real world, a king of angels who always wore a sinister smile on his face, speak the name with such seriousness and solemnity, it made Klein unable to hold back his laughter. Besides, he had no intention of controlling himself. It's best if he gets angry from the embarrassment and kills me. The reason Aemon is this way today has largely to do with the ancient sun god's method of upbringing. The corners of Klein's mouth curved into a smile, prepared to ruthlessly vent his inner laughter. At this moment, another bolt of silvery white lightning streaked across the sky, illuminating the deep ravine. It made Klein once again see the grayish-white building at the bottom. This was a building that was completely different from the current style of the fourth, third, and even the second epoch. Thump. Klein's heart rapidly contracted before it expanded again. The smile he'd just made froze on his face. Thump. Thump. When he heard his own heartbeat, he suddenly had the common sense he had regarding the present world appear in his mind. 12 months a year, 365 days a year, has leap years, 24 hours a day, 60 minutes a day, 60 seconds a minute. It's confirmed to be a planet. There's a sun and a moon in the sky. Badum, badum, badum. Klein's instinct prevented him from thinking any further, but deep in his heart, there was still a voice. Could it be that I've never actually transmigrated? I've always been on Earth the entire time, but I've been hanging from the door of light above the grey fog for too long, making me truly not belong to this era. As this thought formed, many details that didn't catch his attention spewed out like a volcano in his mind. To the easternmost front of the Sonya Sea, before entering the ruins of the battlefield of the gods, there are rotting and crumbling steel buildings around the ancient well. They appeared to be left behind by humans. The northern and southern continent are overall very similar in shape to that of North and South America. However, a large part of the isthmus that connects the two landmasses has been wiped away by some kind of power, forming the Berserk Sea with its complicated and winding sea routes. Also, Sonya Island is like the gigantic landmass in the north that drifted south. Mitsisha is like the expanded and connected version of the Great Lakes of North America. It's as though it suffered a strike from a massive meteor. The mountains and rivers on the northern continent have changed a lot, but the overall shape is barely recognizable. In that case, the western continent where the elves come from, and the forsaken land of the gods in the eastern continent, will correspond to Chernobyl. In the legends of Treasure Out at Sea, there's a lost civilization called the Nuans. It sank somewhere in the Fog Sea. The Giant King's parents are humans. The Sanguine elves also seem to originate from humans. I previously had two questions. Why would Sephira Castle grab transmigrators from Earth? Why would all of them be people from my era? This can also be explained. In the short span of 2 to 3 seconds, it was as if lightning was constantly exploding in his mind. This caused his lips to tremble slightly, as though he was trying his best to contain the backlash of his revelation. But the moon in this world is crimson. The constellations are somewhat different from those of Earth. I'm not an astronomy aficionado, so I can't remember clearly. However, the Emperor consumed the potions from the Savant pathway. If the cosmos was completely identical, he would have discovered it a long time ago. The opposing opinion appeared in Klein's mind. They were like a strong anchor, preventing his ship from being blown away from the port in the midst of the storm. But 1 second later, he remembered 2 lines. One sentence was a terrifying prophecy that he had read online in his previous life: when the stars are right, chaos will rise from underground, and the great oldest one will awaken. The other was, be careful of the moon. That prophecy wasn't randomly made up. When the stars are right. So, this resulted in the previous discrepancies. Klein almost ignored Eamon in front of him. Even his body began to tremble. He used a great deal of strength before he sighed inwardly. Perhaps, I've never left my hometown, but I will never be able to return home. Just as he came to this understanding and realization, the grayish-white fog silently appeared in front of him. This time, he directly stood in front of the waning forest, which corresponded to the end of the first epoch and the early stages of the second epoch. Unlike the past, the boundless grey fog in front of him was no longer empty. Deep in the fog, in a very far distance, points of shattered light were lit up. They were like lighthouses, illuminating the path of history. They led Klein forward as they traced back thousands of years, or even further. Then, he saw the resplendent bluish-black door of light. He saw transparent cocoons hanging above it, and himself in a t-shirt and loose pants. An invisible wind blew past as the grayish-white fog beneath the door opened, layer by layer, revealing cities. There were tall skyscrapers with all kinds of cars parked, frozen with pedestrians that walked past. One by one, these cities were covered in grayish-white dust. Many buildings had collapsed, broken steel bars tearing out of their frames. Some of the cars had caved in, others had broken down. There were even some that had been squashed into metallic pancakes. The passers-by looked lifeless, like wax figures. Upon seeing this scene, Klein stopped and stared intently. He knew very well that this world was Earth. At that moment, he completely digested the Scholar of Your potion. Suddenly, Klein's consciousness returned to the real world. He realized that his connection with Sephira Castle had strengthened. Amidst the buzzing sounds, the resonance generated by the prayers of the Tarot Club members grew in intensity. Previously, he could use them to vaguely sense Sephira Castle above the grey fog and see that the Klein at the Fool's Seat was trying to establish some sort of connection with the dark red, warping figure that was about to take form. In an instant, he came to a realization. There was no longer a need for him to chant the incantation or take 4 steps counterclockwise. With a mere thought, his spirit body could enter Sephira Castle, becoming one with that figure. This was undoubtedly the best opportunity for him to escape. He couldn't be bothered to marvel at the fact that this world was Earth. Believing that Eamon definitely didn't know of such a development, Klein immediately thought of jumping straight towards Sephira Castle. At this moment, the corner of his eye reflected the pointy-hatted, monocled, classic mage-robed Eamon curled his lips into a smile, one that spoke of endless joy. Klein's mind suddenly exploded as all his thoughts were occupied by the crazy raving from Eamon. "You're right. I didn't want to steal your destiny, bearing the burden while becoming the new owner of Sephira Castle. You're right. This was a scam that has been going on since the beginning. However, the core of this scam was to make you think that me giving you hope and destroying it was to break your will and make you agree to become my blessed. If I hadn't specially changed my clothes when I entered the forsaken land of the gods, as well as my accidental use of error powers, would you have been so sure that my true body was already here? Could it be possible that the god of deceit doesn't understand that changing one's image would expose many problems? Did you think that I wouldn't understand what the name Chernobyl means? I've been in the forsaken land of the gods for more than 1,000 years. I've been searching for the oldest traces of history, the ones that go far beyond the first epoch. The true goal of this journey was to give you some time and give you some historical knowledge to aid you in digesting the scholar of your potion, so that you can relax your vigilance in this area. Then, when your connection with Sephira Castle deepens and you attempt to trigger it, I'll seize this opportunity and use a loophole to steal Sephira Castle. The destiny shall be yours, and Sephira Castle shall be mine." Ellipsis. Not only did the terrifying ravings from the King of Angels contain the sounds of Eamon's chuckle, but they also wreaked havoc on Klein's mental state. They were no weaker than Mr. Dawes' roar. The surface of Klein's skin began to show signs of protruding worms of spirit as he was brought to the brink of losing control. In his body, a 12-segmented worm of time burrowed out, transforming into an Eamon phantom wearing a black mage robe and a matching pointy hat and crystal monocle. He had parasitized Klein at a superficial level, not to monitor his thoughts, but rather to take control of the situation at the critical moment through parasitizing him at a deeper level. He wanted to seize this opportunity. In the beginning, Eamon had used a deeper level of parasitizing with one main goal, to parasitize a worm of time at a superficial level, without the Sant being able to detect it. The Eamon projection turned back and gave Klein, who was unable to straighten his thoughts after being disrupted by the ravings, a look. It revealed a smile that was identical to its true body. The corners of his lips curled up slightly, carrying a look of endless joy. He turned around and used the invisible connection to leap towards Sephira Castle above the grey fog. This was similar to the situation of him parasitizing Derek Berg and trying to use the crimson star that corresponded to the sun to infiltrate the world above the grey fog. But this time, no one was inside Sephira Castle to purify him, to close the door, to stop Eamon. This was a spectacular act. This was the god of deceit. In the blink of an eye, Eamon saw the greyish-white fog and the ancient and majestic palace above. He just needed to reach out his hand and pass through the final obstacle to truly touch Sephira Castle and directly occupy the place and, in essence, take it away. But at that moment, a gigantic bluish-black palm suddenly appeared above the Eamon phantom, blocking him from entering Sephira Castle. Eamon's projection subconsciously turned its head and looked in the direction of the palm. It saw the pus-covered, one-eyed giant who had long since died. Bladel, who was known as the god of glory, still didn't show any signs of life in his exaggerated vertical eye. The curse of the greyish-yellow fog kept emanating from his body. However, it was different from before. There were seemingly illusory black tubes behind his back. They extended all the way into the infinite distance, a mystery as to what they were connected to. Boom. Read latest chapters at whooshaworld.eu. The towering bluish-black giant instantly condensed a broadsword formed from the orange-red light of dusk. Holding it in one hand, he cleaved down at the side of the deep ravine where Eamon's body was. This youngest son of the giant king, the one who had died due to the curse, suddenly unleashed an unimaginable power after roaming aimlessly for thousands of years. The twilight sword tore through the void and jumped out from the spot where the Angel of Time, Eamon, was standing. It ripped through everything around it, turning into a storm that could destroy this desolate moor. Eamon didn't move and remained standing there. No matter how the orange-red sword storm raged, it didn't harm him at all. He seemed to have used some sort of error in this world again. However, in this state, Eamon was no longer able to transmit his ravings into Klein's mind, allowing him to finally gain a sliver of peace. Ignoring how he was about to lose control, he regained his clarity of mind using the clear and real surroundings and the layers of prayer. Then, he immediately resonated with the dark red figure, sitting at the fool's seat above the grey fog, and he established a new connection. He didn't hesitate to return to Sephira Castle. And at this moment, Amon's phantom, which was attempting to infiltrate above the grey fog, was obstructed by the bluish-black palm of the god of glory, Bladel. He wasn't able to instantly break through the titanic obstruction. The monocled king of angels, be it his avatar or true body, opened his mouth and said a name, Evernite. Yes, this was help coming from the Evernite goddess, but it wasn't without reason. Although Klein lacked confidence in this matter, he had always kept it as one of his trump cards. He only believed that it might not be effective and had a very low chance of success. It could only be used as a glimmer of hope at his most desperate hour. After entering the forsaken land of the gods and obtaining some space to think on his own, he worked hard to find resources available to him that could be used. Then, he recalled something, the matter of the former chief of the City of Silver. This demon hunter had attempted to switch to sequence 3 ferrymen of the death pathway, but he ended up turning into a monster inside the mausoleum he built. This anomaly was related to illusory black tubes, and such a phenomenon had been seen from the numinous sex artificial death. In other words, the mutation of the former chief of the City of Silver was very likely related to artificial death. This indirectly explained something, that for some unknown reason, those that could influence the forsaken land of the gods, other than the true creator, included artificial death who had come to life, to a certain level. And now, artificial death could be considered the Evernite goddess in some ways. Based on this reasoning, Klein suspected that the goddess could use the uniqueness of the death pathway to exert a low level of influence to some degree on certain things in the forsaken land of the gods. In addition, there were only 3 people involved in the matter regarding the former chief of the City of Silver. One of them was the current chief, Colin Iliad, the demigod elder, Waite Chermont, and shepherd elder, Lovia. They were either sequence 4 saints or an important believer of the true creator. It was impossible for them to be completely unaware that they had been parasitized by Amon. As for the only person who received feedback from the escapade, it was Derek Berg who was under the fool's watch. He wasn't one of Amon's parasites, either. In other words, Amon wasn't aware of the former City of Silver chief's abnormality involving the black illusory tubes. That was key. Therefore, even if he was able to guess that the Evernite goddess had obtained the uniqueness of the death pathway, causing the god of combat to have an intense reaction, there was no way for him to know that this would bring about unforeseen developments to the forsaken land of the gods. With this knowledge in mind, Klein consciously performed certain tasks, despite not having much confidence. In the city that believed in the Phoenix, he didn't take away the remaining death pathways beyond the characteristics, hoping to leave a trail. After summoning Zarathul's historical projection, he didn't seize the opportunity to commit suicide immediately. On the one hand, he was afraid that Amon would still have the ability to stop him and affect his other arrangements, while on the other hand, he tried to use the summoning of the Servant of Concealment Ariana's projection to inform the Evernite goddess about the exact situation. After completing these 2 matters, Klein had no idea what the final outcome would be. He had mostly focused his attention on the fact that Amon's avatar had been replaced by his true body. When he arrived at his final destination and saw the roaming angel's corpse, he had just thought of something when he was distracted by Amon's introduction. It took him only until now to realize that the goddess had long gained some rudimentary control of this giant king's youngest son through the death pathway's uniqueness. She had been patiently waiting for an opportunity to use this cursed angel. And the concealment forces that filled the forsaken land of the gods helped her conceal the illusory black tubes very well. Suddenly, in the ancient palace above the grey fog, at the fool's seat situated at the end of the long, mottled table, the dark red figure that kept warping and scattering took the form of the scholarly Klein with his black hair and brown eyes. With just a thought, Klein's consciousness and spirit body had returned to Sephira Castle. Following that, he used the close connection between his body and Sephira Castle, together with the prayers of the Tarot Club members, to amplify the resonance effect. He then saw himself, glazed eyes, on the brink of losing control. He saw Amon's projection which had circled around the bluish-black palm using an error. The monocled Amon raised his head, making eye contact with Klein, who was seated at the fool's seat. Klein beckoned for the sea god scepter and raised it. The entire grey fog boiled as the entirety of Sephira Castle quaked. A vast amount of terrifying power gathered over, transforming into a torrent of lightning. The blue gems that lit up at the same time sent an illuminating light that surged down like a torrent, drowning Amon's avatars and his own body. A deep rumble of thunder echoed as the terrifying silver lightning tore everything it enveloped apart. Amon's projection disintegrated, and Klein's body was destroyed. He had finally succeeded in committing suicide. After completing this attack, Klein, who was high above the grey fog, immediately cut off the connection between Sephira Castle and the real world, so as to prevent Amon's true body from creating any new accidents. Right on the heels of that, he began to wait for the miracle, and waited for his resurrection. Beside the deep ravine which had greyish-white buildings at the bottom, Amon's true body adjusted the crystal monocle, stealing the curse that kept Bladel existing. The bluish-black giant immediately began to rot, quickly being reduced to bones. The illusory black tubes didn't persist, and they instead shrank back into the depths of the darkness. Dressed in a pointed hat and a classic black robe, Amon stood there. He raised his head and looked into the sky silently for a few seconds, as though he was looking at Sephira Castle through the fog of history. Finally, he pinched the crystal monocle and muttered to himself, as the corners of his mouth curled up. Interesting. Ellipsis. In the ancient palace, at the end of the long, mottled table, Klein sat at the seat belonging to the fool. He carefully looked down at the greyish-white fog. He discovered that the beyonder characteristics that had been destroyed with his body had unknowingly entered the historical void. It fused with the worms of spirit from the past, turning them corporeal. As long as Klein willed it from Sephira Castle, these worms of spirit would immediately be able to escape the fog of history and reform his body in the real world. The miracle of resurrection was essentially a deeper use of one's strength from the past. Miracles happen using the past and future. Klein frowned slightly as he attempted to analyze how the miracle in Miracle Invoker came about. After thinking for a few seconds, he quickly pulled his attention back and attempted to revive himself in Sephira Castle. Then, he discovered a problem: his body could only be revived in the real world. Furthermore, it had to be within a certain range of his remains. As for his spirit body, it could be reborn above the grey fog, but Klein's spirit body hadn't been destroyed, it was sitting on the high back chair of the fool. Obtaining help from the past works. The number of resurrections I'm using now is depleting the number I'll have after I become a miracle invoker. From the looks of it, there's only one chance now. TSK. Amon should be guarding my corpse now. I have to think of a way to get out of this predicament. His sense of time is different from a human's. He's a very patient god of mischief. Yes, my current state can only be maintained for 3 days. After that period of time, I won't be able to borrow powers from the past to resurrect. If it really doesn't work, I'll just abandon my body and become an undead. Klein's mind raced. Although he was somewhat vexed, he was in his most relaxed state over the past few days. He finally got out of that nearly hopeless situation. He looked at the high back chairs that had symbols light up on their backs, as well as the burgeoning and contracting dark red stars. Klein exhaled and relaxed as he leaned back into his chair. He couldn't help but reveal a smile. These are my anchors. Author's note: this arc has finally come to an end. The whole story's origins was when I was reading the Cthulhu myth. When I saw the line about the stars being right, I suddenly thought of this. We often say that Cthulhu will awaken soon, but what happens if Cthulhu has already awakened? For those who don't know much about Cthulhu, it doesn't matter. Just treat this name as an evil god. After all, the corresponding deities were completely reconstructed by me. The flashing dark red glow slightly warmed Klein's heart. He felt that he wasn't that lonely, and that someone still remembered him. As the illusory, overlapping sounds of prayers became clearer and clearer, turning increasingly real, noisy, and chaotic, he realized that Sephira Castle was summoning him, and the resonance between the two was growing stronger. After all the members of the Tarot Club had completed the prayers, Klein had a vague feeling that he could enter Sephira Castle at any time, allowing his consciousness to manifest there instantly. However, he was still obstructed by that one last obstacle. This problem was finally resolved after he completely digested the Scholar of Your potion. It was also because of this that he had the opportunity to return to Sephira Castle before Amon broke past the obstruction from the God of Glory, Bladel. In just 2 short days, all the members of the Tarot Club have prayed. Generally speaking, there shouldn't be a coincidence like this. Some aren't problematic, but there are some that seem to have been affected by the goddess and will. I was lucky enough, so I naturally had a good development. After careful thought, he realized how unreasonable certain parts were, but this was something that could be explained, and there was no need to pay too much attention to it. After changing his seating posture slightly, Klein's gaze gradually darkened. Although he felt that he might not be able to return home the moment he saw the door of light and cocoons, he still felt that his hopes were completely destroyed upon confirming that this world was his former hometown. The light of dawn was swallowed by the darkness. Back then, using "the fool that doesn't belong to this era" as an honorific name might be a revelation given to me by my spiritual intuition. In the deepest part of my heart, I might have sensed something. Yes, I remember that I'd transmigrated while I was sleeping. But why was I wearing a t-shirt and loose pants while hanging in the cocoon? Klein frowned slightly as he cast his gaze at the grayish-white fog under Sephira Castle. As he searched for the reason for the fragments of light in the fog of history, he tried hard to recall every detail of that fateful night. Finally, he found the corresponding historical segment. Joe Mingrui, who was wearing a t-shirt and loose pants, set up the luck enhancement ritual before dinner. He took 4 steps counterclockwise and recited incantations like, "The immortal Lord of heaven and earth for blessings." In his memories, nothing had happened back then, but the scene in history wasn't like this. After Joe Mingrui finished his 4 steps and completed the ritual, his face turned pale and his eyes glazed over. Following that, he ate his meal in a daze. He read books, watched dramas, and fiddled with his phone as if he was completing a predetermined program. Finally, Joe Mingrui came to the sink and looked at his lifeless eyes in the mirror. He brushed his teeth, washed his face, and went to bed. During this process, he didn't change out of his t-shirt and loose pants. He covered himself with the blanket and closed his eyes. Before long, an intense light and violent shaking ended the corresponding historical scene. Klein couldn't help but raise his hand and rub his temples. He gave a self-deprecating laugh. So the idea of there not being any changes and everything being normal after the luck enhancement ceremony was simply what I concluded. In actual fact, my body had already experienced certain anomalies. If it were in the past, he would definitely feel horrified and scared about the truth of the matter. However, after suffering from shock so many times, with his worldview nearly collapsing just moments ago, such a trivial matter was unable to generate any intense ripples in him. However, after discovering this, combined with the Emperor's transmigration, a result of buying a mysterious silver plate, as well as one of the hanging spirit bodies in the transparent cocoons actually having a cell phone on them, Klein quickly had some guesses about what had happened back then. It should be the owner of Sephira Castle affecting reality, disseminating the luck enhancement ritual, mysterious silver plate, mutated cell phones, and other things. Anyone that obtains them and performs some required procedure would end up being pulled above the grey fog at some point, hanging by the door of light. This was a random selection. It didn't point to a specific target. I don't know if I'm lucky or unlucky. However, why was it named Quintessential Divination and Arcane Arts of the Qin and Han Dynasty? Was it randomly made up by the influenced humans, or was it really passed down from the Qin and Han Dynasty era? It's not that it's impossible. If the "when the stars are right" prophecy is true, and if it corresponds to the Creator, the oldest one, then he has always been in a deep slumber underground. He was like that in ancient times, a time that was far more ancient than ancient times. As for Sephira Castle, it said that it was a manifestation of parts of his body. This isn't a sanctuary or escape pod. In the beginning, the oldest one was, on the one hand, waiting to awaken and destroy the world. On the other hand, he was trying to influence reality with a tiny amount of constant fluctuations. By disseminating the ritual and making other arrangements, wouldn't that be somewhat contradictory? That prophecy must have been made by the humans that were influenced by him. Klein stretched out his right hand and lightly knocked on the edge of the long mottled table, stuck in a conundrum that was temporarily impossible to answer. Soon, he remembered a sentence and some things. That statement was, "Whatever separates will definitely converge, and whatever converges will definitely separate." Those things were, the ancient sun god, Amen and Adam's father deliberately separated, his negative personality, beyonders who were close to the ground or encountered some corruption would gradually form a brand new self. After reaching the moon, Emperor Rosel's personality had changed a little without him realizing it. Many of the 22 Beyonder pathways were conflicting, just like Demoness and Hunter. Perhaps the Creator, the oldest one, was an amalgamation of contradictions, and he could only relieve this problem by sleeping. Klein had a certain guess, but he was unable to verify it. He wasn't even sure if the oldest one, who would awaken when the stars were right, as spoken of in mythical legend in his previous life, was the creator of all things who splintered into everything in present-day myths. This required more clues and more evidence to confirm. He couldn't just rely on his own guesses and imagination. It's not like I'm a visionary, Klein thought in a self-deprecating manner. He then cast his gaze upwards. It was almost comprised solely of grey nothingness there, with some greyish-white clouds floating there. There are still many things I need to confirm. For example, is that so-called Chernobyl a sanctuary created by humans after the awakening of the oldest one? Or did the Beyonder characteristics of the 22 Beyonder pathways really originate from the oldest one? Another would be the positions of the constellations. Is it actually normal, or is it abnormal now? Does the 1368 apocalypse correspond to the moment when the stars are right? And finally, the origins of the first blasphemy slate and what exactly is on the moon. Thinking of this, Klein suddenly stopped tapping his fingers and softly said, for example, the hometown of the elves, the legendary western continent, whether it exists or not, and why can't anyone go there? The answer to his question was a long period of silence. He slowly leaned back and rested his arms on the armrest. After a few minutes, Klein closed his eyes and had an idea. Or rather, he decided. After he successfully revived, he planned on staying in the forsaken land of the gods for some time to seek out some questions. Just as Emperor Roselle had said, many of the answers were in the forsaken land of the gods. Blasphemer Aemon had wandered here for more than 1,000 years to explore the history that surpassed the First Epoch. Furthermore, if he kept heading east in the forsaken land of the gods, he might reach the legendary western continent. Klein cast his gaze outside the ancient palace as he looked into the distance. To him, staying in the forsaken land of the gods for some time was also a type of strategy. At the very least, this would attract the attention of Aemon, making him not need to mobilize his avatars in the outside world to search for Gehrman Sparrow in Loen or Backland. That would bring great danger to the people that he knew. Thankfully, the avatars of Aemon who knew that I'm soft-hearted had been wiped out. The corresponding information was also not propagated because of the existence of concealment. If not for that, Aemon might end up directly using the lives of Benson, Melissa, Leonard, and Miss Justice to threaten me. I don't even dare to think of the outcome. Hey, the King of Yellow and Black who wields good luck has finally shown its powers. For you, even if I want to leave the forsaken land of the gods, I don't have a solution now. I have to barge into the place where the Dark Angel is sleeping. Klein shook his head and felt that even if he could resurrect, he would be facing all kinds of dangers. No matter how he thought about it, a scholar of yore wouldn't last long if he were tracked by a king of angels. The key to the matter was that the Evernite goddess was still digesting the uniqueness of the death pathway. She could only spare a limited amount of power for infiltrating the forsaken land of the gods. Once the Angel of Time, who wielded the authority of error, was prepared, it was nearly impossible to accomplish what had happened today. On the one hand, I have to seek help from other possible existences. When I successfully revive, I will attempt to use my marionette to recite the honorific name of the Lord of Storms, Eternal Blazing Sun, and the God of Knowledge and Wisdom. Let's see if they have any means to descend into the forsaken land of the gods. They had fed on the ancient sun god back then, so they definitely do not wish for Aemon to obtain Sephira Castle. On the other hand, since the Scholar of Yore's potion has been completely digested, I'll have to consider becoming a miracle invoker. As long as I have an angel's status and become a complete mythical creature, my situation will be much better. At the very least, I'll be able to withstand a wave of Aemon's ravings when facing his true body. Klein decided to use the medium to spy on the terrifying maggot cluster on the main peak of the Hornachus mountain range once his spirit body recovered. From there, he could obtain the knowledge corresponding to a miracle invoker. It was highly likely that it was the half-fool of the Antigonus family. After considering his future plans, he looked around and answered the crimson stars one at a time. The tarot gathering will proceed as usual today. He wanted to see if Ma'am Hermit, Mr. Hanged Man, and the others could provide him with inspiration and allow him to be revived far away from Aemon. Of course, it was necessary to use an ingenious excuse. After responding, the world above the grey fog became extremely quiet again. Klein sat at the seat of the fool, temporarily with nowhere to go. After a moment of silence, he leaned forward slightly and used his right hand to support his head, looking straight ahead. On the long, mottled table, a variety of delicacies and exquisite candles appeared. As for the high-backed chairs around it, they became even closer in style to the current times. One figure after another appeared. One of them was an elderly man with a loud voice and silver strands in his black hair. Another was a woman who was nearly 50 years old. She had an Asian face with short hair that only reached her ears. Some of them were young men who were playing with their phones and enjoying the sumptuous food, while others were young ladies who were laughing and joking. Behind them, new figures appeared one after another. It was the grey-eyed Dun with a receding hairline, and Daly with her blue eyeshadow and blush. With a smile on their faces, they surrounded the long, warm table surrounded by candlelight above the greyish-white fog. They chatted happily and commented on the delicacies from time to time. Klein maintained his expression and posture as he propped his hand on the side of his face and silently watched this scene in stillness for an extended period of time. Report Chapter. Backland, Northborough. Leonard, who had just arranged a mission for his team, saw the boundless grey fog and heard Mr. Fool's response. He let out a long sigh of relief and said in a low voice, "Seems like there are no more problems." Since Mr. Fool was able to provide feedback, as per normal, and convene the tarot gathering, it meant that he had already won the battle against Eamon. This way, Klein was likely able to escape from his predicament. In Leonard's mind, Palais Zoroast's slightly aged voice scoffed, "Don't count your chickens until they've hatched. After you enter Sephira Castle, observe if the fool is wearing a monocle on his right eye." Are you saying that the present fool might be Eamon in disguise?" Leonard's eyelids twitched as he hurriedly asked. Palais sighed and said, "You can't eliminate this possibility. Eamon can really do such a thing. I will take note." Leonard's relaxed state of mind instantly tensed up again. On the future, in the Sonia seat. Mr. Fool actually responded after so much time. Does this mean that the World Gairman Sparrow's disappearance had something to do with his plan? I can't be sure. Perhaps Mr. Fool's lack of response during this period of time was to save Gairman Sparrow. And now, he has succeeded. He didn't directly mention this matter. He is planning to let the world tell the story at the tarot gathering. After hearing Mr. Fool's voice, many thoughts instantly flashed across Catlia's mind. From Queen Mystic's letter, she suspected that George III's death was due to Mr. Fool's interference. The disappearance of the World Gairman Sparrow was also an extension of this matter. Catlia's first reaction was to write to Queen Mystic Bernadette and tell her that Gairman Sparrow has been found. However, after some thought, she suppressed her urge, and she prepared to participate in the afternoon's gathering. She wanted to know the details and figure out what she could and couldn't say before sending Queen Mystic feedback. Regardless, it seems like the matter has been resolved. The Admiral of Stars exhaled and sat by the window in peace as she took in the blue sky. In the periphery of a primitive forest on Sonia Island, Alger Wilson stood on a thin tree branch, looking at the port and the blue skies not far away. The strong winds around him swirled without dispersing as they affected the trees nearby. As the illusory greyish-white fog appeared, Alger was first delighted before he felt a little terrified. Mr. Fool only responded after quite some time. This means that his previous state was indeed a little abnormal. However, he has already recovered. He didn't respond to my lone request regarding the sun's unshadowed crucifix. He discovered my test and discovered a hint of my hidden thoughts. I can't do such things again in the future. Mr. Fool has only issued a simple warning this time. He might punish me directly next time. Thou shalt not test God. Thou shalt not test God. As his thoughts raced, Alger lowered his head and piously said, "Thank you for your kindness and forgiveness." Ellipsis. Backland, inside the Hall family's luxurious villa. Mr. Fool didn't pass on my question to Mr. World. Is this because the tarot gathering will proceed as normal in the afternoon, and there will be time for us to communicate? Audrey realized certain problems from the delay in the response. Generally speaking, Mr. Fool's reply is very timely. It was more than 15 minutes this time. He was handling other matters, very important matters. Is it related to George III's death? Regardless, a 15-minute delay wasn't too serious a problem. Audrey quickly retracted her thoughts and felt much better. I'll know the truth from Mr. World later. I hope that this incident won't have any more serious consequences, other than a full-scale war. At the moment, war is already unavoidable. Northborough in Backland. Beneath St. Samuel Cathedral. Mr. Fool didn't say that he would help me. Emlyn White held a cup of red liquid and frowned slightly. He then interpreted the symbolic meaning of the response from another angle. Mr. Fool specifically emphasized that the tarot gathering will proceed as normal in the afternoon. He wants to tell me that the opportunity to escape from the predicament lies with a member. Could it be the star? In short, I should be able to leave this week. Emlyn had been taken into protective custody and kept behind St. Samuel Church's Cheney's Gate, so no matter what happened in the outskirts of Backland, it was unlikely for it to affect him. Furthermore, it was impossible for him to suddenly escape from prison and head to places like the Blood Emperor ruins. Therefore, when Klein hinted to the other members last week, he hadn't been involved. In the Berg household in the City of Silver. Upon hearing Mr. Fool's response, Derek jumped up from bed. The excitement from his face was overflowing. Mr. Fool hasn't disappeared. Mr. Fool hasn't forsaken the City of Silver like the Creator did. He paced back and forth a few times, feeling the urge to immediately rush out of the room and head to the Twin Towers where he could tell the chief the good news. However, having had more than a year to mature, those experiences had left a clear mark on him. Finally, he calmed down and decided to attend the tarot gathering and obtain the promise of receiving the blessings before he sought the chief again. Perhaps, the lack of response during this period of time was a test of me, the chief, and the City of Silver, one set by Mr. Fool. He wanted to see if we would rapidly lean towards the fallen Creator. It was unknown when Derek's thought processes had a hint of the Hanged Man's colorful thoughts. Of course, he didn't have any other thoughts because of this. From what he knew, it was very normal for deities to test their believers. Back then, the Creator had left behind many similar legends. Despite being done with his contemplation, Derek still couldn't sit still, and he continued pacing back and forth in his room. He had never felt such anticipation towards the tarot gathering in the afternoon. In the City of Silver, in the forsaken land of the gods, the afternoon was a relatively abstract concept. As there weren't enough labels to confirm the time, they could only use the frequency of the lightning to define day and night, without going into any finer details. Backland East Borough, inside a 2-bedroom rental apartment. After receiving Mr. Fool's response, Foles couldn't help but laugh out loud. As a best-selling author, she had a rich imagination. Before Mr. Fool responded, she had already come up with one terrifying story after another. Mr. Fool had exchanged his death for George III's failure. Mr. Fool's ploy was discovered by the deities and was besieged. Mr. Fool's old injuries relapsed and he fell into a deep sleep. Without his blessings, the world Gairman Sparrow was being pursued by his enemies. These stories didn't develop in the same way, but the end was very similar. Foles would once again succumb to the full moon's ravings, eventually losing control and becoming a monster. Phew. Foles exhaled and said to Zio with a beaming smile, I just realized today that Mr. Fool is the most important man in my heart. Him. More importantly, you have to become a demigod as soon as possible and completely escape the curse of the full moon, Zio replied seriously. After joining the Tarot Club, she had learned of her friend's true situation. Yeah. Foles nodded and said with a smile, in short, I need to drink a glass of wine to celebrate. Above the grey fog, inside Sephira Castle. After calming down, Klein used cogitation to restore his spirit-body state. When I first learned cogitation, I was required to imagine something that doesn't exist in this world so as to replace what's on my mind. That way, I can truly enter cogitation. At that time, my first reaction was to outline an intercontinental missile from Earth, but I didn't succeed. Hey, I didn't think too much about it back then. Now, in hindsight, this might have already spelled certain problems. It's not something that doesn't exist in the world, but one that has been snuffed out in the fog of history. Klein rubbed his temples and naturally recalled a matter of the past. He immediately focused his mind and planned on obtaining the miracle invoker potion formula before the Tarot Club. At that moment, Eamon was patiently guarding the spot where he had died. He could only stay in Sephira Castle, so there was nothing else he could do. After some consideration, he grasped towards the exterior of the ancient palace and pulled an item from the grey fog's historical void. It was a black notebook bound with a hard paper cover. Paper. The Antigonus family's notebook. Sure enough, it's not a manifestation of the uniqueness. It's just that there are some powers left behind by the half-fool of the Antigonus family. Klein sighed and threw the notebook onto the long bronze table in front of him. This was because the content of the notebook might be problematic. He didn't intend to decipher the formula of the Sequence 2 miracle invoker through it. He was only using it as a medium for divination. Following that, Klein conjured a pen and paper and wrote a divination statement, the original owner of this notebook. Putting down the pen, he picked up the paper and notebook, leaned back in his chair, and repeated the words he had just written. After repeating it 7 times, he entered a hazy dream. He saw a mountain peak that reached into the clouds. At the top of the mountain, there was a dilapidated towering palace that was separated from reality. In the palace, there were many places covered with moss and weeds. At the very end of the hall was a huge stone chair. Its surface was inlaid with dull gemstones and gold. In the middle, countless transparent maggots were huddled into a cluster as they slowly squirmed and grew, extending out like slippery tentacles covered in patterns. Unlike before, this time, Klein saw the monster directly and clearly saw his actual appearance. The palace above the grey fog suddenly began to shake violently, and Klein's figure was hoisted up in midair. In the next second, his spirit body collapsed into numerous squirming worms of spirit that crawled all over the ground. Sephira Castle immediately quaked, and everything returned to its original state. Klein's spirit body took form once again. He sat at the fool's seat and rubbed his temples before saying with a wry smile, "It really is the half-fool with the uniqueness." After he muttered to himself, Klein did a slight recollection before picking up the pen and began to write down the knowledge he had obtained from prying into the secrets of the mythical creature. Sequence 2, Miracle Invoker, main ingredients, 1 heart of the dark demonic wolf, god of wishes, or the beyond a characteristic of another miracle invoker. Supplementary ingredients, 300 ml of dark demonic wolf's blood, 1 worm of time, 1 worm of star. Advancement ritual, return a piece of history that has been left behind to the present era. Let a piece of history that has been left behind return to the present era. Return, not reappear. The meaning of the two are completely different. It's not sufficient for me to write the true history of the 4th or 3rd epoch and disseminate it to complete the ritual. Klein's right hand, which was holding the fountain pen, paused. He instinctively analyzed the contents of the Miracle Invoker potion. After some thought, he found something that perfectly matched the ritual's requirements. That was to let the people of the City of Silver escape the forsaken land of the gods and return to the northern and southern continents, allowing this history that had been left behind for 2,000 to 3,000 years return to the present era. This isn't any easier than escaping Amon's pursuit. The only way to leave the forsaken land of the gods is to enter the giant king's court and open the palace where Dark Angel Sasria is in deep slumber. This is the ancient sun god's negative personality. It's ranked first among the kings of angels and is known as the left hand of God, the deputy of heaven. He might even be stronger than the current Amon. Besides, his current state is being watched by the various deities. Yes, the more controllable aspect of this compared to my escape from Amon is that I can make sufficient preparations. Klein slowly exhaled and felt that there was a certain chance of completing the ritual. In fact, he knew very well that, even without him, the City of Silver would make repeated attempts to open the door to the giant king's residence and find a way to leave this forsaken land. It was as if they were moths darting towards the flames, even at the cost of death. No matter what, with my participation, the chances of success will definitely be higher than what it is now. Klein subconsciously wanted to open the door to the Dark Angel's slumber ground to attract Amon, creating chaos to offset the damage caused by the Dark Angel's awakening. This was a tactic he was rather familiar with. However, he eventually rejected this idea because it was too dangerous. After spending some time with Amon and finally seeing the level of a king of angels, Klein instinctively began to fear these terrifying existences. He no longer wanted to use the conflict between them to create chaos. Just, their existence alone could cause irreparable damage to the surrounding Beyonders and the entire region. Under such circumstances, trying to rely on them to create a chaotic situation was no longer tottering on the edge of the abyss. If one wasn't careful, they would fall into the abyss and into eternal damnation. Therefore, it was best not to try. Unless he had no other solution, to the point of escaping being just his wishful thinking, Klein didn't want to make such an attempt. Indeed, a portion of a miracle invoker's beyond powers comes from history, which is why there's a ritual requirement like this. How did the other scholars of yore complete it? Looking at the parchment on the long bronze table, he thought of a possible solution from another angle. If it were me, the only solution I can think of is to isolate some people or history from reality. Only when they are forgotten will I allow them to return to the present era. This might take centuries, or even longer. What an evil act. Hey, it reminds me of the peach blossom spring. Those people living in utopia away from the outside world share some characteristics. After some thought, Klein believed that the difficulty of this ritual for scholars of yore was whether they could survive until the ritual was held. Furthermore, there were too many accidents that could interrupt self-isolation like that. The Forsaken Land of the Gods has perfectly resolved these issues, but it also brings with it greater problems. Dark Angel Sasria. What is the condition of this heaven's deputy right hand now? Is it related to the resurrection of the ancient sun god? The level involved in such a matter has already reached the ceiling of this world. Why am I always involved in such matters? Klein gave a self-deprecating laugh. He could roughly guess that this was due to the destiny Sephira Castle brought him. After all, blasphemer Aemon was unwilling to shoulder such a destiny. Retracting his wandering thoughts, he focused his attention back onto the miracle invoker potion formula. The Worm of Star is from the Apprentice Pathway. The supplementary ingredients contain 3 high-grade spiritual materials of the 3 neighboring pathways. I've already made the Worms of Time into Fate Siphon charms. There's no way to restore them. Let Leonard's grandpa lend me another one. How can that be called lending? I'm going to use the upgraded version of a Yesterday Once More charm to exchange for it. Where should I find the Worm of Star? There aren't many demigods from the Apprentice Pathway that live in the real world. The Aurora Order's Saint of Secrets, Botus. However, I'm stuck in the Forsaken Land of the Gods and can't deal with him. All I can do is ask Mom Hermit and Queen Mystic for help. At the same time, I have to urge Miss Magician to become a traveler as soon as possible. Yes, I can also get her to ask her teacher where Worms of Cosmos might be. There's actually only one main ingredient. It's either the heart of the dark demonic wolf or the Beyonder characteristic produced by other miracle invokers. It's no longer 2 as 1. Yes, that also means that, at this level, there are very few scattered characteristics. They've all gathered. The dark demonic wolf is also known as the god of wishes. That's a standard angel, a subsidiary god. If I can't find any materials that can be used, wouldn't I be slaying a god? The level of an angel can already be considered a hidden existence. There's a fundamental difference from being a sequence 3. Just thinking about it makes me scared. After making a list of helpers that he could rope in, he felt a lot more at ease. He had a feeling that he no longer feared his debts when they reached a significant amount. He lifted his right hand that was holding the fountain pen, and he continued to record what he had previously learned. Most of this was something he already knew, and he could only use it as a reminder. Finally, he wrote down incomplete information in the corner of the parchment. Sequence 1, Attendant of Mysteries, main ingredients, 1 Attendant of Mysteries beyond a characteristic. This piece of information meant that Sequence 1 Beyonder characteristics were difficult to obtain through other means, with only 3 to choose from. One of them is on the half-full on the main peak of the Hornachus mountain range. It's with the uniqueness. The other is with Zaratul. There's still one more. According to what Leonard said, the true creator has clues to its location. Where could it be? Yes, Little Sun and the rest had hunted shapeshifters in the northern city ruins, Noise. There seems to be a high-level existence of the Seer pathway lurking there. I wonder if it corresponds to Miracle Invoker or Attendant of Mysteries. Klein gradually had a thought, and he planned on visiting Noise for a preliminary investigation after he resurrected and escaped Aemon. After digesting the knowledge he had gained, he summoned his golden pocket watch from the junk pile and opened it to check the time. Before he destroyed the Blood Emperor's ruin, he had sacrificed many things that he didn't need in battle, above the grey fog to prevent any damage. Despite that, he still lost quite a bit after the battle and his eventual suicide. Furthermore, they were all extremely valuable. Just the thought of it made him almost lose control. Grozel's Travels, Death Knell, Creeping Hunger, Fate Siphon Charm, Flaring Sun Charms, Marionette Konas and his equipment, Marionette Enony and his 2 rings, and the Adventurer's Harmonica. No, I can't think about it anymore. Thankfully, I had thrown Azek's copper whistle above the grey fog ahead of time. Thankfully, I can still summon the historical void projections of these items. They're just accompanying me in a different form. Probably not for Grozel's Travels. Klein's temples throbbed as he couldn't help but feel heavy. He sighed and seriously mourned over the items, especially the mystical item that had accompanied him for a long time, Creeping Hunger. After a long silence, Klein forced his attention back to the present. As he waited for the tarot gathering to begin, he casually thought about the ancient sun god and the other matters such as Chernobyl. Suddenly, he frowned slightly. Since this is my hometown, there have never been transmigrators. They're all ancient humans that were released by Sephira Castle. Then, do places like the Chaos Sea also have similar existences? Was Chernobyl converted into a sanctuary? According to what Aemon said, and what I saw in my divination, the ancient sun god had indeed woken up in Chernobyl. Then, is he a transmigrator, released from Sephira Castle, or a survivor of a sanctuary? If it's the latter, who's the third person inside the cocoon? Upon thinking of this, Klein was alarmed as his pupils dilated slightly. He already had a certain guess about the history of the elves. It likely had nothing to do with Sephira Castle. This way, he still couldn't find the correct corresponding identity of the third, or more correctly, the first, transmigrator. This transmigrator didn't seem to leave behind any traces in history. Without any hesitation, Klein's consciousness sank into the grayish-white fog. With the power of Sephira Castle, he came directly to a certain part of history that was relatively distant. It was made up of many fragments of light, and the clearest one was the suspended Joe Mingrui above the Door of Light. And beside Joe Mingrui, the corresponding fog of history was instantly lit up due to his sufficient knowledge of Roselle. He saw a young man who also had his eyes tightly shut in the cocoon. There was no need to verify it. Through that sense of familiarity and spiritual intuition, he confirmed that this was the former incarnation of Emperor Roselle Gustav, Huang Tao. Without bothering to appreciate the Emperor's true appearance, Klein turned his gaze to the other side. There was a transparent cocoon there, and the figure inside could vaguely be seen. As he had already seen the other hanged figures, he had lit up many fragments of light in the fog of history. They interweaved and stimulated each other, barely allowing him to see the fuzzy area. The figure inside was obviously a woman. Female. A thought came to his mind as he realized that he had missed a direction when he analyzed the transmigrator. Transmigrators had an objective mindset. They could completely control themselves and not leave any traces that exceeded the times, but there was one thing that couldn't be avoided. It was very obvious that Sephira Castle was related to the three pathways related to the seer, apprentice, and marauder. After the birth of a transmigrator, they had to quickly make a connection with one of these three pathways. Not only was Klein involved in the case brought about by the Antigonus family's notebook, but he also quickly had the opportunity to choose the seer potion. In Intis, where Roselle was active, there was the secret order, and he got to know Zaratul early on. According to this logic, the ancient sun god with the marauder authority was indeed one of the reasonable suspects. Klein immediately conjured a pen and paper and began listing the corresponding names he knew at the moment. For example, Fourth Epoch people from the Antigonus, Zaratul, and Abraham family, or the kings of angels surrounding the ancient sun god. Before long, Klein's gaze stopped on a few names. The first person was none other than the ancient god, Phlegraea, who clearly had the authority of seer. Behind him was his subsidiary god, the god of the dead, Salinger, and the goddess of misfortune, Ammonizes. The latter was also known as the Evernite goddess. Report chapter. Klein stared at the parchment in front of him for a long time without moving. After a while, he gently tapped the edge of the long mottled table, causing all the items that he conjured to disappear. He summoned his golden pocket watch and opened it to take a look. He sent a message to Little Sun, informing him to prepare to participate in the tarot gathering. About 1,000 heartbeats later, dark red beams of light rose from the two sides of the long bronze table, condensing into different figures on different high-backed chairs. Without any gaps in time, all the members of the tarot club looked at the figure sitting at the very end, who was shrouded in grey fog. Seeing that Mr. Fool wasn't wearing a monocle, Leonard inwardly heaved a sigh of relief. Then, he turned around and looked at the bottom of the long, mottled table to confirm the situation of the world. Klein Moretti. Similar to him, Katlia, Audrey, and Fours instinctively turned their attention to the world Gehrman Sparrow after seeing Mr. Fool. One of them knew that the world was in a dangerous situation and could only seek Mr. Fool's blessings. Another had failed to receive any feedback for 2 days, and she suspected that Gehrman Sparrow had really been embroiled in the matter regarding George III, with something definitely having happened during that time. The final one knew that George III's matter was extremely risky, and was a little worried that Mr. World would suffer serious injuries. Seeing that the world Gehrman Sparrow was perfectly fine without any abnormalities, Audrey retracted her gaze, curtsied, and bowed towards the end of the long bronze table. Good afternoon, Mr. Fool Tilda. With the world situation becoming even more chaotic, she felt a little comforted by the fact that the Tarot Club could still maintain its original state. This significantly improved her mood. After the Tarot Club members bowed under Miss Justice's lead, the Fool Klein nodded slightly, indicating for everyone to sit down. Then, he slowly surveyed the area and smiled. It seems all of you were very concerned whether today's tarot gathering would proceed as usual. Upon hearing this, Alger's heartbeat sped up as he heard thumping sounds. Without a doubt, he believed that Mr. Fool was referring to him, and was giving him a gentle punishment. In other words, he had given him a chance to repent. Alger lowered his head and said with a trembling voice, "We weren't pious enough and thought too much." Why is Mr. Hanged Man apologizing on my behalf? Fours, who had instructed Zio to ask Mr. Fool if the tarot gathering would proceed as scheduled, was stunned for a moment before she gave up on thinking. She then turned to the end of the long bronze table and lowered her head. She repeated, "We weren't pious enough and thought too much. So I wasn't the only one who prayed to Mr. Fool over the past few days. Mr. Hanged Man claims to have overthought things because there was a possibility that the tarot gathering would be cancelled, causing him to have some unnecessary speculations. But Fours shouldn't have thought of that." Audrey looked across the table and then to her sides, feeling enlightened. The Fool nodded and looked around again. Such concern is considered normal. He laughed and sighed. "I've recently used the world's body to play a game with Aemon in the Forsaken Land of the Gods. Thankfully, we didn't have to skip this tarot gathering. Everything he said was the truth, but what the others would decipher from this information was definitely far from the actual situation. And this way, even if the news of the World Gaemon Sparrow being equal to the Fool was released, the members of the Tarot Club would only sneer in their hearts that Aemon was trying his deceitful tricks again. To have a period of time that the world was equal to the Fool didn't necessarily mean that the world was always equal to the Fool. A portion of the truth was also a lie. Played a game with Aemon. Old Man's guess was right. Mr. Fool was deliberately using Klein to bait blasphemer Aemon. From the looks of it, he had obtained a rather satisfactory outcome, allowing Aemon to suffer a terrible loss. Leonard, who had long come up with speculations, felt that this was completely in line with his expectations and didn't doubt Mr. Fool's words at all. Mr. Fool didn't reply for 15 minutes because he was in a critical moment battling Aemon. He has already recovered to such a state. Audrey was pleasantly surprised and shocked when she heard that. For some reason, she felt a strong sense of honor. Alger could also tell from Mr. Fool's words that he had taken another step towards his recovery. He was actually able to hold the upper hand against the King of Angels. This made him even more frustrated at himself for having doubts and testing the Fool. Mr. Fool had hinted in advance that the tarot gathering might be cancelled because he had long predicted that there would be a conflict between him and Aemon. In fact, it's even possible that he had taken the initiative to create this episode by setting up a trap for Aemon. Alger instantly made many connections and felt that there was no way he could hide his thoughts in front of such a high-level existence. He warned himself once again, "I can't do such things again." So Mr. World didn't provide any feedback because his body was being used by Mr. Fool to resist Aemon. That King of Angels, Aemon, is truly powerful. Mr. Fool actually needed to personally take action. Fours and Zio exchanged looks, not having any more doubts about the previous questions. Katlia roughly understood the reason why the world had disappeared. She also guessed that the messenger who had the contractual ties with the world likely wasn't able to enter the Forsaken Land of the Gods. At the same time, she was surprised by the appearance of a King of Angels appearing on stage in the present times. She felt that this was one of the signs of the apocalypse. Emlyn wasn't aware of what happened recently. He merely looked at everyone with a somewhat blank look. For some baffling reason, he felt that he had been locked behind Cheney's gate for far more than a week or two. Perhaps it had been a month or two, to the point that he felt like he no longer had a grasp over the current situation. Mr. World has come to the Forsaken Land of the Gods. Did Mr. Fool use his body to engage in a battle with that terrifying Aemon? Derek was first alarmed before he felt a strong sense of joy. This meant that the City of Silver's next exploration would receive tremendous help. He immediately looked towards the end of the long bronze table, and he blurted out, "Honorable Mr. Fool, the chief wishes to receive your blessings for a ritual. Are you agreeable to such a request?" Having long learned of this from his prayers, Klein nodded slightly and said, "Sure." After receiving his promise, Derek couldn't help but smile. For a moment, he didn't know how to express his gratitude. 2 seconds later, he lowered his head and said loudly, "My faith lies only with Mr. Fool." The fool nodded and turned to look at Ma'am Hermit. He warmly said, "What questions do you have this time?" The Queen didn't say anything in her letter. Katlia was taken aback as she decided to first ask something she wanted to know. After all, she could still ask several questions. She deliberated for 2 seconds before saying, "Honorable Mr. Fool, what's the truth behind George III's death?" The moment the hermit said that, Justice Audrey and company immediately focused their attention. This was exactly what they wanted to know. Amongst them, the star Leonard had a certain level of understanding over the matter. He was more concerned about the deeper reason behind this incident. And among the members of the Tarot Club, the only one who was more confused about the situation was Emlyn. His mind was filled with thoughts like, what, and what happened? He hadn't even read the newspapers recently, so he didn't know that King George III had been assassinated. As for the son, although he wasn't sure why George III died for no reason, he didn't care at all. The fool Klein smiled and said calmly, George III wanted to become the Black Emperor. And for this reason, he dug up the Tudor ruins, engaged in human trafficking, and created the Great Smog of Backland. He initiated a war, allowing the Fezak airships to bombard Backland. Unfortunately, he failed at the final ritual, and the secret mausoleum he needed for the ritual was destroyed. He briefly described the entire incident in the calmest tone he could make, doing so without mentioning what he had done. It would be beneath Mr. Fool to explain the situation on his own accord. The Great Smog of Backland. The airship raid. This was all done by George III to become a god. Audrey's eyes widened as she instantly recalled the two things she had experienced before. Suddenly, she understood why the World Gairman Sparrow wanted to stop George III from becoming a god. She knew that he was a gentle and kind gentleman, and he would definitely not allow the culprit behind these two tragic cases to go scot-free. If it were me, I would also have thought of doing so, but I would hesitate and be stopped by the possibility of ill developments. As for Mr. World, he is firm and decisive. This is a matter that involves the deities. Yes, there should also be the will of Mr. Fool in this matter. Audrey glanced at the World Gairman Sparrow, who was sitting silently at the other end of the long, mottled table. She nodded slightly to express her agreement. Black Emperor. George III wished to become a god. Yes, Mr. Fool has the Black Emperor card of blasphemy. Gairman Sparrow was previously investigating the matter of the Great Smog and human trafficking. Indeed, all of these are connected together. There was actually such a secret hidden behind it. From the looks of it, Mr. Fool's goal has been achieved. His plan has succeeded. Therefore, he has taken one more step towards his recovery. He can now face off with a King of Angels head-on. The more Alger thought about it, the more fearful and spirited he became. He felt that, despite knowing of some clues ahead of time, he was completely unaware of Mr. Fool's setup. Amidst the shock experienced by Leonard, Fors, and the other members of the Tarot Club, Katlia, who already had a premonition, suppressed her emotions and decided to ask another question. Honorable Mr. Fool, what's the attitude of the 7 deities regarding this matter? Good question. The fool Klein inwardly praised her, and he explained by using the Red Angel Evil Spirit's explanation in his own words. The 7 deities wish to have a Black Emperor, but they are not unanimous in their candidate for the Black Emperor. When George III successfully obtained the ticket to becoming one through secret preparations, the 7 deities had no choice but to accept it, regardless of whether they approved of him or not. So that's the situation. Apart from the moon Emlyn and the sun Derek, the other members of the Tarot Club were enlightened. They roughly understood why the churches acted in a rather contradictory manner when faced with the tragedies of the Great Smog of Backland, the deaths caused by the Fezatian air raid, and George III's assassination. Following that, they suddenly had a question. Since George III had already made preparations and had reached the final step of carrying out the ritual while obtaining the tacit approval of the 7 deities, why would he fail? They immediately thought of an answer, because Mr. Fool didn't agree to it. In the destruction of George III's Black Emperor ritual, the churches probably didn't do anything to stop it. Perhaps, they even provided some help to Mr. Fool's subordinates. Did the Church of the Lord of Storms make use of this chaos to secretly do something? No, they likely wouldn't conceal it too much. Leonard recalled all the details he had previously discovered, and he was confident of his grasp over the overall situation. The 7 deities' tacit approval. Mr. Fool vetoed it and sent the world and other blessed to secretly destroy George III's apotheosis ritual. But what has this got to do with the Queen? Why did she discover that Gairman Sparrow has gone missing? Black Emperor. The Queen might have participated in the operation led by Mr. Fool, and later, discovered that a participant had gone missing. Catlia made a guess at the truth through her rich knowledge and insight. And at this moment, Emlyn had just managed to make heads and tails of the discussions that had just been discussed, and he managed to understand the developments outside during his time in protective custody. George III had secretly plotted to become a god and received the seven deities' tacit approval. In the end, Mr. Fool's blessed destroyed his ritual, causing him to die on the spot. Seeing that everyone was silent, the Fool Klein looked at the hermit Catlia and said, "Any other questions?" "There's nothing else this time." Catlia bowed her head even lower. She was more respectful than before towards the mighty figure at the end of the long bronze table. Although she had long known that Mr. Fool had the Snake of Fate, Death Consul, an ancient bane under him, and was in secret control of the life school of thought, she still never expected that the powers Mr. Fool could mobilize in the real world were able to destroy a king's apotheosis ritual. Furthermore, he had foiled a plot of a king of angels, the son of the Creator. Mr. Fool's hidden forces are more exaggerated than I imagined. What effect do the members of the Tarot Club exert on him? A backing faction? Individual growth? Or is it just a backup plan? Catlia instantly thought of many things and momentarily forgot that she was already a Sequence 4 demigod. No matter which organization she was in, she was considered a member of the upper echelons. Just the feats displayed by Mr. Fool is enough to make a saint lack confidence. Justice Audrey only took a glance at Ma'am Hermit before she interpreted her mental state. At this moment, the Fool Klein nodded. "You may begin." Upon hearing this, Leonard immediately turned to the other end of the long, mottled table and said to the world, "How's your situation now?" Fours, Zio, Audrey, and the other members of the Tarot Club also cast their gazes over, expressing their concern for the world Gairman Sparrow's situation. From their point of view, Mr. World, who was stuck between Mr. Fool and Angel of Time Amon as a combat tool, was probably in a bad situation. His survival meant that he was already considered lucky enough. Feeling the varied concern, Klein controlled the world and chuckled hoarsely. "Not too bad, but not too good either. It's all thanks to Mr. Fool's grace that I finally obtained a secret from Amon, but I haven't completely escaped from his grasp." Without waiting for everyone to respond, he continued, "I'm currently in a rather sticky situation. I relied on Mr. Fool's powers to enter a certain concealed state and temporarily extricate myself from Amon's grasp. However, if I were to dispel this state and return to the real world, I'll only find myself back where my body is. And it's very likely that Amon is still loitering nearby. I would like to make an attempt at finding a solution. I wonder what your opinions are regarding this matter." The meaning behind the world Gairman Sparrow's words was very clear. He wanted to rely on himself first, leaving Mr. Fool's help as a last resort. And his actual meaning was essentially the same: find a way to bypass the restrictions first. And in the case that his solution didn't really work, then he would consider living in the state of being undead. Solution. Alger and company were suddenly a little excited because the suggestions they provided would be used to fight against the King of Angels. If they were employed and were of use, then this would be a proud moment in their life, one that would remain for the rest of their lives. Audrey was just about to speak in excitement when she retracted her words. This was because she knew that she couldn't give random suggestions, otherwise, it could lead to Mr. World getting caught by Amon. Zio thought about it seriously and realized that she couldn't come up with any useful suggestions. She could only choose to observe and learn. Must it be where your body originally was? Do you have any blood or hair that was kept elsewhere? Alger thought for a moment and gave a suggestion using a question. The Fool Klein thought for a moment and made the world shake his head. No. Compared to his original body, a single tube of blood was too little. Thinking of this, Klein suddenly had an idea. Perhaps he could use those 2 tubes of blood as ingredients, combining them with other methods, using alchemical life to create a new body. There are 2 problems. Firstly, alchemical life requires the spirit body's involvement, otherwise, the final product might not be considered my body. Secondly, I don't know any demigods who can complete alchemical life. The only one barely related to them is Frank Lee. Will I end up becoming a mushroom man? Then, I'd be better off as an undead. As Klein thought about it, he nearly shivered. After the Hanged Man's suggestion was rejected, the hermit Catlia set off from her knowledge of mysticism. She deliberated and asked, "Do you have a Sequence 3 sealed artifact?" "Why do you ask?" the world asked. "A Sequence 3 sealed artifact can respond to prayers within a certain range. You can make use of that," Katlia explained simply. Klein roughly understood what Mom Hermit was thinking. "You're talking about descent." "That's right. Get someone to set up a descent ritual at the periphery, and you should be able to respond to it in your own concealed state." Katlia first glanced at the sun and described the specific plan. Then, she realized something as she asked, "Do you really have a Sequence 3 sealed artifact?" She originally wanted the world to seek Mr. Fool's bestowment. "I'm already a Sequence 3 Beyonder," Klein replied simply as he controlled the world. Quote ellipsis quote. The members of the Tarot Club were momentarily speechless. They knew very well that Mr. World must have advanced to Sequence 4 at the end of June to become a demigod. And now, it was December of the same year. "The Queen once said that using the blood of the Snake of Fate to advance would make it easier for me to become a Sequence 3 clairvoyant than others. Besides, the Tarot Club has given me plenty of precious mysticism knowledge. It has greatly helped me digest the potion. But even so, I still need another half a year before I have a chance of attempting to reach Sequence 3. The hermit Katlia subconsciously looked around and discovered that the other members wore stupefied and envious looks. She sighed silently and said, "Is my suggestion useful, Mr. World?" The World Gairman Sparrow shook his head. "There is a huge restriction when responding in that state. Once he chose to descend, it would mean that he would begin the rest of his life, no, afterlife, as an undead. Perhaps, I can combine the two methods. Yes, I can use the method of praying to the Fool, sea god, or protector of magic and drama performers to leave the forsaken land of the gods, but that's not urgent. It's too easy to reveal the truth." The Fool Klein made the world look at the star Leonard while in thought. Leonard instantly understood what he meant. He tersely acknowledged, "I'll go back and do some research to see if there are any other ideas." Clearly, his true intention was to ask Old Man when he was back. He was an angel who knew Eamon rather well. Perhaps, he could come up with suggestions that no one else could think of. This was the answer that Klein wanted. He immediately made the world say, "Okay." After the discussion of how to escape his predicament came to an end, the World Gairman Sparrow looked at Fours. "Help me ask the Abraham family if they still have any worms of cosmos that have yet to lose their spirituality. If there are, what will be the price for the exchange?" A worm of star was a high-level spiritual material. Most of the time, it didn't contain any Beyonder characteristics. Therefore, their spirituality would suffer an irreversible loss. Without any special methods, it would be difficult to preserve it for too long. Worms of cosmos. Fours was taken aback before she nodded. "All right." After receiving an answer, Klein made the world cast his gaze at the hermit Katlia. "If Miss Magician isn't able to exchange for a worm of star from the Abraham family, I would like to entrust you with a mission." "What mission?" Katlia asked with interest. The world said with a smile, "Hunt the Aurora Order's Saint of Secrets, Botus." "The Aurora Order's Saint of Secrets, Botus. Mr. World wants to hunt him." Force's first reaction was that she had heard wrongly. After all, Gairman Sparrow had no connection to the Saint of Secrets. However, she quickly had a rough idea from the worm of star that had just been mentioned. This made her suddenly excited and thrilled. This was because she also wanted to hunt the Saint of Secrets, Botus, to avenge her teacher's family. However, due to her lacking strength and the inability to pay for it, she had kept this thought to herself. Although it sounds like Mr. World doesn't plan on personally taking action, Mom Hermit is also a Sequence 4 demigod, and she has the support of that Queen Mystic behind her. "I can provide the utmost support within my abilities." As her thoughts raced, Fours cast her gaze at the hermit beside her, waiting for her reply. After some thought, Katlia said, "Botus is very likely a saint of the apprentice pathway. It's very difficult to hunt him. Besides, he has the Rose Redemption backing him and the True Creator's protection. With my current level, it's almost impossible for me to complete this mission solely on my own. You can seek the help of Queen Mystic. I will also arrange for other partners for you." Klein made the World Gairman Sparrow reply in a low and hoarse voice, "The reward is the right to choose the spoils of war first, and mysticism knowledge that will allow you to digest the potion within this year." It's December. Katlia's heart palpitated when she heard that. She deliberated and said, "When the time comes, I will try, but I cannot guarantee success." No matter how difficult the mission of hunting the Saint of Secrets was, it couldn't be as dangerous as accepting the knowledge injection process from the hidden sage. And as for the mysticism knowledge provided by the latter, they didn't necessarily aid in digestion. There was a high probability that it included mathematics, machinery, and literature. No problem. As long as you do it seriously, I'll still compensate you with the mysticism knowledge even if you fail in the end. The world nodded and confirmed the deal. At this moment, Foz finally couldn't help but speak out. Mr. World, Ma'am Hermit, can I join this mission? I might be able to provide some help. Even if you didn't, I would have gotten you too. The fool Klein secretly laughed and made the world nod gently. There's a spot reserved for you in this mission. Foz wasn't surprised at all. She asked curiously, what can I do? What do you need me to do? Gammon Sparrow replied in an extremely calm tone, bait. Quote ellipsis quote. Foz opened her mouth, momentarily at a loss for words. She had a feeling that she knew that this would happen. The world Gammon Sparrow continued, similarly, you also have the right to choose the spoils of war. You'll be just after Ma'am Hermit. Also, during this period of time, I can help you record beyonder powers like traveling. Foz had never expected a reward, as it was her greatest reward to be able to exact revenge successfully. In the future, she might even receive additional rewards from her teacher. Without any hesitation, she nodded and said, okay. The world immediately cast his gaze towards Miss Justice. How's the digestion of your Dreamwalker potion? Thanks to the expedition into Grozel's travels and the persistence she had put into her acting, the speed at which she digested the potion was very fast. Her eyes darted around as she thought for a moment. I've already concluded the acting principles. In another 2 to 3 months, I should be able to completely digest it. It's a little slow. Klein mumbled inwardly as he made the world say, create more opportunities to act. If you can digest the potion before Ma'am Hermit attacks the Saint of Secrets, I can give you Vin Rambus's Beyonder characteristic ahead of time as payment so that you can join in on the operation. Klein believed that he would have to stay in the forsaken land of the gods for a very long time. Most of the matters in the outside world could only be interfered with through the members of the Tarot Club. It was also beneficial for him to increase their strength as soon as possible. Furthermore, he wasn't directly giving it to her. The difficulty of hunting the Saint of Secrets Botus was just as Katlia had said. It was rather difficult. Alright. Audrey was just fretting over how she could accumulate more credit with Mr. World. Therefore, she naturally agreed without any hesitation when she heard his offer. In her heart, the members of the Aurora Order were lunatics and destructive maniacs. There was no need to find a reason to deal with them. In addition, Audrey had previously been troubled by her lack of experience as a Beyonder. This gave her a chance. Although it was rather dangerous, it was still an opportunity. Gammon Sparrow sure is generous. To provide the knowledge that can help a mysticologist digest the potion and a sequence 4 demigod characteristic. This shouldn't only be for the Worm of Star. It sounds like a supplementary material. He's helping the members of the Tarot Club improve as quickly as possible according to Mr. Foolswool, so as to be effective in the future. Alger listened to the world's conversation with the other members and vaguely grasped a certain truth. This made him rather vexed. He suspected that if he hadn't lacked faith and had other thoughts, to the point of foolishly testing Mr. Fool, he might have already been assigned a mission that could aid him in pushing open the door of godhood. At that moment, Justice, who had agreed to the request, glanced at the magician and said with a faint smile, I'm looking forward to the Abraham family not having any Worm of Star. Me too. Foz nodded seriously, indicating that she had the same thoughts. Seeing that the world was done speaking, Katlia thought for a moment and said to Judgment, do you want to join this mission? Do some intelligence gathering on the periphery. Your ability in this area left a deep impression on me. Even without Ma'am Hermit's invitation, Zio wouldn't refuse in helping her friend. She nodded gently and said, I don't have a problem if the operation is in Backland. If it's somewhere else, my role would be greatly discounted. A sheriff and their own area of jurisdiction were always connected. The more familiar they were with the place, the better they could showcase their abilities. Once they exceeded that range, they could only rely on their Beyonder powers. Your reward is being third to choose the spoils of war. Katlia looked at the star once again. If there's a need, I hope you can allow the official factions to appear at the right moment. Leonard chuckled. I hope you don't have to go that far. My reward shall also be a spoil of war. If my dear poet friend here wasn't invited in the end, then the mission of hunting the Saint of Secrets would have nearly become a sorority for the female members of the Tarot Club. The fool, Klein muttered inwardly as he made the World Gairman Sparrow finalize the matter. All that was left was to wait for the Abraham family's feedback. Following that, Alger and Derek reached a rental arrangement for the unshadowed crucifix. Just as they entered the free exchange segment, Emlyn couldn't help but look towards the end of the long bronze table. "Honorable Mr. Fool, can you give me a hint? How should I escape protective custody?" The fool, who was shrouded in the grey fog, nodded slightly and said simply, "This week." His answer was said with great confidence, but it wasn't a prophecy, but a judgment of the situation. The current situation had Fazak and Intis attacking Lowen, while Finepotter was attacking Lowen's allies, Lenberg, Masson, etc. The three churches definitely didn't wish to suffer any damage the Sanguine could bring while already having existing enemies. Therefore, Emlyn would be released very soon, but it was hard to say for Father Utreski. Similarly, the Sanguine's focus would definitely be shifted to the global situation. It was unlikely for them to have the motivation to continue probing Emlyn and his other partners. In addition, in the past 2 days, the one whose reason for praying was the most forced, apart from Zio, was Emlyn White. Klein suspected that he had been locked in the basement of St. Samuel Cathedral all this time because it was convenient for the goddess to exert her influence on him. Now that the matter had ended, he was no longer of any use. Combined with the three factors, it wasn't difficult to conclude that Emlyn would be free in no time. The only exception was that if this fellow had really been forgotten. Be it the Church of Evernight or the Sanguine, they had forgotten that there was such a fellow locked behind Cheney's gate. If that was the case, Klein would get the Star Leonard to provide him with some assistance. Emlyn heaved a sigh of relief and sincerely thanked Mr. Fool. At the end of the free exchange, the World Gairman Sparrow suddenly looked at the hanged man. "You said that you've already arrived on Sonia Island and are inside the primitive forest." "Yes," Alger replied in puzzlement. Gairman Sparrow pondered for a moment. "You can try to seek out an elven ruin. Perhaps you might chance upon some sort of opportunity." Alger suddenly thought of the Book of Calamity and the scenes he had seen in his dream. He nodded thoughtfully and said, "All right." After another round of exchanges, the tarot gathering came to an end. Audrey and company stood up and bowed before leaving the world above the grey fog. After returning to his body, Leonard immediately lowered his voice and described Klein's predicament. Finally, he said, "Old man, do you have any good suggestions?" "My suggestion? I think it's better to ask the fool for help," Palais Zoroast replied without any hesitation. Leonard coughed lightly and said, "Aren't you going to use this opportunity to make things difficult for Eamon?" "Making things difficult for Eamon?" Palais Zoroast chuckled. "What benefits can there be? Otherwise, forget it." Leonard was momentarily at a loss for words. After a few seconds, he said, "At least it can make you feel good." Palais chuckled. "I will feel better if you don't bring this topic up." Without waiting for Leonard to respond, this sequence one Angel from the Marauder Pathway sighed with his slightly aged voice. "Doesn't your former colleague have a deceit charm? Perhaps he can use this to come up with a solution." After getting rid of the Eamon avatars in Backland, Palais had given the godhood symbols and magic labels needed to make 4 charms: deceit, parasite, deprivation, and aging, to Leonard. Leonard had passed on this knowledge to Klein, and the latter had used the knowledge and the Worms of Time to create 1 deceit, parasite, and deprivation bullet each. Later on, he had used them to deal with Kona's Kilgore, but Leonard wasn't aware of this. Leonard whispered thoughtfully, "Old man, are you saying that by using the deceit charm, you can mislead Eamon and cause him to misidentify the location, preventing him from influencing Klein's escape?" In his mind, Palais Zoroast snapped back, "Do you think it's possible to use a deceit charm in front of a Marauder Pathways King of Angels?" "It's impossible." Leonard laughed dryly and pressed in a thick-skinned manner, "What do you mean then?" Palais Zoroast's voice suddenly sounded more spirited. "Deceive the rule that one can only return to where one's body is." "Deceive the rule? That works too?" Leonard asked in shock. Palais gave a self-deprecating laugh and sighed. Compared to deceiving Eamon, deceiving a rule is much easier. After all, underneath this world is madness and chaos. This sentence made Leonard speechless for a moment. On the one hand, he wasn't experienced enough. He didn't know that orders and laws could be deceived, and on the other hand, he never expected that, in Old Man's heart, Eamon was even more terrifying than the laws of nature and the order of the world. After nearly 10 seconds, he spoke again. "With this method, how high is the possibility of success?" "It's very, very low," Palais said with a sneer. However, the probability of deceiving the order of the world like this with a deceit charm made from a worm of time from Amon's avatar is very, very low. Therefore, my suggestion is still to get him to make a request to the fool for help. Don't waste any more time. When fighting Amon, the longer the delay, the more dangerous it will be. Leonard pondered for a moment before nodding in agreement. I understand. I'll also advise him to do so. Of course, he wouldn't forget mentioning the highly improbable method that Old Man had suggested. It's good that you understand. Seriously, disturbing an old man's reading. As Palais mumbled, his voice gradually lowered and disappeared from Leonard's mind. In 7 Pinster Street, the newspaper that was placed on the coffee table suddenly flew up and automatically spread open over the sofa. Using a deceit charm to deceive the requirement that I can only resurrect where my original body is. Above the grey fog, in the ancient palace, Klein reconstructed Palais Zoroast's suggestion, in his own words. As soon as he finished speaking, he recalled the animal hide lantern that kept burning. Amon had deceived the laws of nature, allowing the candle to remain in a magical state and continue burning for a week without needing any fuel. His eyes lit up as he whispered, "This line of thought is something only an angel from the Marauder pathway can think of immediately. It might not be impossible." Like Palais, he did feel that, compared to dealing with Amon, it was much easier to deal with the laws of nature. After seeing Hope, he immediately analyzed the possible outcome. Although I've already used the deceit bullet, I can summon it from the historical void. After all, before the effects end, I'll definitely reform my body and successfully resurrect. The laws of nature are truly pitiful. Not only will they be deceived, even the item used to deceive it is fake. The only problem is that the bullet might not be able to deceive the mysticism law. It was already a little difficult to deal with Kona's Kilgore back then. Amidst his thoughts, he slowly surveyed the area and gradually gained inspiration. That was to use Sephira Castle. After gaining initial control of Sephira Castle, he could already mobilize the power of a Sequence 2 angel here. And many of the things he had come into contact with previously had explained that the authority of Sephira Castle had a high probability of spanning over the 3 pathways of Seer, Apprentice, and Marauder. It could generate a convergence effect on the corresponding Beyonders, and it had clearly attracted the attention of Amon. That was to say, Klein suspected that Sephira Castle had the power of these 3 pathways at the same time. However, as a seer, most of the power he could stir was concentrated in this domain. With the help of the medium known as the Deceit Bullet, I might be able to stir the other powers of Sephira Castle. Since I'm already capable of using some miracles in the seer domain, having power from the Marauder pathway at the angel level is a highly reasonable deduction. The only problem is that there must be a medium of a sufficient level. This way, I don't have to worry about not being able to deceive that rule. As his thoughts brightened up, he seriously began to formulate a plan. He used the mysticism laws as his target and attempted to formulate a scam. In order to reduce the difficulty, it's best to have additional preparations. I can't deceive something out of nothing, at least unless I'm Amon's true body. Yes. I'll bestow a tube of my blood to Little Sun. I'll create a fake respawn point that exceeds the range. And then, using the Deceit Bullet as a trigger, stir the corresponding angel-level powers contained within Sephira Castle, misdirecting that rule and making it view the fake respawn point as the real one, while the real one becomes the fake one. He outlined the details bit by bit, and when his thoughts finally took form, Klein immediately used the mysticism connection between himself and the spot he died, to observe the actual situation with his true vision. He saw that the grayish-yellow fog had thinned a lot, and the deep ravine that hid Chernobyl was no different from before. It was unknown where Amon, who was wearing a pointed hat and a monocle, had stolen a rock from and had placed it on the spot where Klein had passed away. He sat on it and patiently played with a human-skinned glove. He occasionally bent the human-skinned glove's finger and stretched it at other times, as if he could pass 100 years doing that. About a kilometer away, in a certain spot in the grayish-yellow fog, 3 Amons in black classical mage robes crouched around a rock as they seriously played poker cards that they had stolen from somewhere. From time to time, they would nudge their monocle. Elsewhere in this extensive moor, Amon would be either alone or in groups, strolling leisurely, writing in thought, or discussing all sorts of questions with one another. In the dark and dangerous forsaken land of the gods, it was such a harmonious scene. It would have been better if the young men weren't all the same, wearing classic black robes, pointed hats and monocles, with similar black hair, black eyes, broad foreheads, and thin faces. Just as Klein was about to make a further observation, the Aemon sitting on the rock suddenly raised his head. He nudged his crystal-carved monocle and looked at him. Across the moor, all of the Aemons looked up at the highest point of the fog of history. Klein immediately retracted his gaze and cut off the connection. In the City of Silver, Derek Berg arrived at the top of the spire and met Chief Colin Iliad. "Your Excellency, I've already received the promise of blessings," Derek said frankly and directly. With white hair and an old scar on his face, Colin Iliad was visibly relieved. He slowly nodded and said, "That's good. That's good." He had repeated the sentence in a rare instance. As an excellent demon hunter and the City of Silver's chief, he had always been patient, never taking unnecessary risks. Therefore, with the sudden lack of a response from the fool, he didn't immediately turn to the true creator, and he decided to wait patiently for another month. For the City of Silver, which had been waiting in the Dark Ages for more than 2,000 years, a month was something that could be accepted. Without waiting for Derek to reply, Demon Hunter Colin left the window and calmly said, "Head back first. I'm going to start preparing for the advancement ritual." Derek glanced at the chief and said sincerely, "You'll definitely succeed." He didn't stay any longer. He immediately left the spire and returned home. After setting up the ritual again and placing the 6 powerful corpses that he had hunted to the correct position, Colin Iliad began to concoct the potion. After all of this was done, the City of Silver chief closed his eyes and lowered his head, chanting in Jotun, "The fool that doesn't belong to this era, the mysterious ruler above the grey fog, the king of yellow and black who wields good luck." Above the grey fog, Klein saw ripples of light emanate as he heard a slightly illusory prayer. He immediately summoned a paper figurine and combined the power of Sephira Castle with it. He threw it into the prayer circle and conveniently marked the City of Silver's chief. At the same time, with the help of this prayer circle, he observed the situation of the entire spire and the City of Silver. He confirmed that there was no sign of Aemon's parasitic existence near the chief or little son. "I have to seize this opportunity." Klein immediately conjured the world Gehrman Sparrow and made him pose as he prayed. At this moment, Colin Iliad saw the light. In the holy light, a holy angel with 12 pairs of illusory wings suddenly descended. As clean, white feathers fluttered down, the demon hunter was embraced by these wings of light. This was a blessing from Mr. Fool. In the face of the angel's embrace, Colin Iliad wasn't astonished. He accepted everything with a calm expression, as though he was already prepared. The ritual began. He took a step forward, picked up the Silver Night potion, and poured it into his mouth. Without a sound, this demon hunter's body swelled up, turning into a grayish-blue giant with bluish-black veins covering him. He stood several meters tall, with black cracks on his forehead. Every inch of this giant contained the indescribable power of mystery and terror. Apart from his head, which still retained the appearance of a human, the rest of his body was akin to a mythical creature that exerted a strange mental influence. In the next second, the skull underlying Colin Iliad's head seemed to soften as it sank inwards. With the black crack as its core, his head slowly squirmed, as though it was forming a nebulous vortex. Such pain made the City of Silver's chief, who had killed many powerful creatures, unable to restrain himself. He let out a series of howling cries that could make the minds of ordinary creatures split apart. If it wasn't for the fact that Colin Iliad had already evacuated the members of the spire in advance, leaving behind only the demigod-level Waite Chermont to watch over him and prevent any accidents from happening, many Beyonders would have definitely lost control. The remains of the 6 powerful living creatures that were situated in different spots floated up under the invisible power of the ritual, circling the mutated Colin Iliad, using some sort of mysterious connection to awaken some of the memories of this peerless demon hunter. It was the experience of hunting demons. It was him painfully ending the former chief's attack with his own hands. It was his life of defeating powerful monsters again and again. These manifestations appeared like painting on an altar. Sometimes, they would be integrated into Colin Iliad, and sometimes they would be extracted from him, helping him define himself. He maintained a certain level of clarity during the extreme pain and changes. Only at this moment did Colin Iliad finally understand the essence of the ritual. As a sequence for Demon Hunter, the hunting of every powerful creature was a battle of intense mental catharsis. It left a deep impression in his life. With these powerful mental imprints, he was able to locate himself after consuming the potion, and not be lost in pain and madness. This made Colin Iliad recall a term recorded in some of the books in the City of Silver, Anchor. At Sequence 3, he was considered a deity in a certain sense. He could respond to prayers within a certain range, so an anchor was required. As this wasn't the level of an angel, an anchor didn't necessarily need to be a believer. It could be replaced by other things, such as the clear marks in one's life that had meaning in mysticism. In the memories that had been awakened, Colin Iliad slowly regained his self-awareness. He felt his body again and grasped its changes. Right on the heels of that, a layer of wings formed from illusory light extended out from behind him. They fused with the surrounding paintings, as they constantly shrank inwards. The surface of Colin Iliad's body collapsed into a silver armor that was firm and beautiful, but it didn't possess any weight to it. After the demon hunter advanced to a silver knight, due to the difference in the deity's blessing, there would be minute differences between silver knights. Previously, the leader of the King Court's chasers, Light-Color Merskogen, had received blessings from the Giant King. Therefore, the various aspects of the Silver Knight domain were much stronger. On the other hand, Colin Iliad could occasionally make his body condense a silver rapier that could teleport. While in combat, it would appear at random during an attack, with beneficial tendencies, bringing about unpredictable changes. In addition, he could also obtain a certain uniqueness when using mercury liquefaction. As the silver armor finally took form, Colin Iliad had completed his advancement. Apart from not having a single vertical eye on his head, he was equivalent to a mythical creature. At this moment, he raised his right hand and waved it to the side. At a small hill outside the city of Silver, a silver beam erupted out of thin air. It tore apart everything around it, splitting the small hill into two halves. During Colin Iliad's advancement to Silver Knight, Derek Berg completed the bestowment ritual and obtained a small metal tube. Seizing the opportunity of the City of Silver's chief creating abnormalities and drawing away most of the attention, Klein suddenly reached out while in the ancient palace above the grey fog. He had summoned a bullet and death knell from the historical void. Right on the heels of that, he did a divination in advance, confirming that there weren't any signs of Amon's parasites around Little Sun. Without any hesitation, he opened the revolver's cylinder and stuffed the deceit bullet into it. With a shake of his right hand, he closed the cylinder and used the mysticism connection to aim at the spot where he had died. Bang! He calmly pulled the trigger and fired the only bullet. At the same time, taking advantage of this beyonder effect, he willed Sephira Castle's powers into mobilizing. The grey fog boiled once again, including the space around them. A majestic but slightly dark energy surged out like a tidal wave, wrapping around the bullet, passing through the gap and shooting towards the real world. The light in Sephira Castle suddenly dimmed. Suppressing his fear and horror, Klein used Death Knell's historical projection to simulate the feeling of a sudden descent. He leaped towards the crimson star representing the sun and leaped towards the tiny tube of his blood. On the barren moors of Chernobyl, all of the Amons wearing pointed hats raised their heads and looked at the lightning that streaked across the sky. They looked at a deep and quiet swath that even the lightning couldn't illuminate. The Amons nudged their monocles, and after a moment of silence, they laughed. He doesn't seem like someone who can come up with such a solution. Halle. He joined this organization codenamed the Tarot Club. In the Berg household in the City of Silver. The darkness in front of Derek suddenly turned dark, as if the candles in the room had been burned to ashes. To the residents of the City of Silver, this wasn't a good thing. Derek's eyes immediately lit up with the light of the sun. At that moment, bits of light burst out from the deep darkness like transparent squirming worms. The metal tube that Derek had received shattered automatically as fresh red blood floated out from it and suspended itself in midair. It didn't spread apart but instead merged with the fragments of light. In just 2 or 3 seconds, these light fragments condensed into one, forming a huge ball of light. The spherical light ball stretched out and changed, quickly forming a figure. The figure had a deep outline and a cold expression. He wore a silk half-top hat and a black coat while holding a black iron-black revolver. It was none other than Gehrman Sparrow. Having successfully deceived the laws of mysticism, Klein used the help of his old blood to complete his resurrection. Without needing any introduction, Derek had already recognized the visitor through his special temperament. After being stunned for a moment, he instinctively revealed an uncontrollable smile. Mr. World. Klein raised his head slightly and looked at Little Sun, who seemed to have grown taller. He subconsciously reached out and pressed down on his top hat. He then nodded gently and said, "I will be in the forsaken land of the gods during this period of time. However, I have to leave now. I can't lure Amon into the City of Silver." If there's a chance in the future, I will cooperate with you." Having understood what Mr. World meant, Derek nodded heavily and said, "All right." Just as Klein raised his right hand and was about to snap his fingers to leave with flaming jump, Derek looked at him and suddenly pointed to the storage cabinet in the room. "Mr. World, do you need to bring some food with you? There are mushrooms that can produce milk." Klein controlled himself, not letting the corners of his mouth twitch. He maintained his cold attitude and said, "I don't drink milk." As soon as he finished speaking, he snapped his fingers, causing a scarlet flame to fly out of his pocket, wrapping around him like water. The fire quickly dissipated like falling stars, and Klein's figure disappeared from Derek Berg's room. Outside the City of Silver, in a deformed forest, flames flashed continuously, extending all the way to the moors leading to the north. After he truly left the City of Silver did Klein slow down his footsteps, and summon a lantern from the historical void. He had long expected that the revival process would go so smoothly. After all, once he found the correct solution, there was no way that Eamon could stop him. In the City of Silver, Eamon only had a few avatars at the Sequence 4 or 3 level, so Klein could use his true vision to locate them and eliminate them ahead of time. And if they could form an avatar at the Sequence 2 level, Klein, who had gained initial control of Sephira Castle, could stir powers at the power of an angel, allowing him to easily fight such an avatar while being above the grey fog, and would stay undefeatable since he couldn't be attacked. He had the confidence to defeat his opponent. If Eamon moved his true body to the City of Silver, then Klein could choose to revive at his original spot. Of course, Eamon could create an avatar that was almost at Sequence 1 and send him to the City of Silver. However, under the premise of the conservation of Beyonder characteristics, how many avatars could he create? Not more than 2. As for Klein, he could split his remaining blood into multiple portions. He could use the bestowment ritual to send them to Mr. Hanged Man, to Mom Hermit, and to the Star Leonard. There were too many spots where he could revive, so there was no way that Eamon could guard all of them. This was an above-board plan based on his own level, Beyonder powers, and the special ability of Sephira Castle. Before he attempted to revive himself, Klein was already quite certain of the outcome. The only thing he was worried about was that deceit would be detected by Eamon ahead of time, allowing him to interfere in a timely manner, causing his respawn location to change. Fortunately, his divination had confirmed that the level of danger wasn't high. This was one of the reasons why he dared to try. "Phew, I've really escaped from Eamon." As he advanced amidst the dim yellow light, Klein felt the presence of his body, and he heaved a sigh of relief. Of course, he knew very well that he was going to encounter the relentless pursuit of Eamon's main body and various avatars. On the desolate moors filled with deep ravines, Eamon stood in different spots. They opened their mouths and chanted in Jotun, the blessed of the spirit world and Sephira Castle, the mystery stemming from ancient times, the witness of an extended history, protector of backland magic and drama performers, the great Gehrman Sparrow. These voices were layered as they bored into the void, as though they extended to an infinite distance. 10 seconds later, all of them adjusted their crystal monocles in different manners and chuckled softly. He changed it really quickly. If Gehrman Sparrow was still automatically responding to this honorific name, they could then use this opportunity to determine the other party's location and create an error to appear directly beside the target. In the darkness that was illuminated by lightning from time to time, the hatted and coated Klein proceeded north at a moderate pace while holding a lantern. "There's a prayer." Eamon is using Gehrman Sparrow's honorific name. This means that a number of Eamons aren't too far from me. But the City of Silver doesn't have his parasites. They're in the surrounding patrol teams, or in some unexpected creatures. As he walked, Klein suddenly turned his head and listened carefully for a few seconds. Regarding this matter, he was rather glad that he was cautious enough. He had changed the honorific name that allowed default acknowledgement while above the grey fog. It went from the protector of backland magic and drama performers to protector of all poor children in Backland. This came from the Loan Charity Bursary Foundation he had set up. Yes, Eamon is a cryptologist. It's very likely that he can interpret this honorific name from all the information regarding Dwayne Dantes. No, I don't even need an automatic response. As Klein looked at the faint yellow light emitted by the lantern, he quickly made a decision. He made every worm of spirit only capable of listening to prayers, without having the ability to autonomously respond unless they had been given permission from the main body. This way, frequent prayers would severely affect his daily life, but it wasn't a big problem. This was because, other than Amon's vile harassment, no one else would pray to Gehrman Sparrow since he hadn't spread the word about his honorific name. After settling this matter, Klein thought of all of Amon's terrifying aspects. He suddenly had some doubts about what to do next. His original plan was to stay far away from the City of Silver and head to the Noise ruins in the north to investigate the situation there. He wanted to see if he could obtain the main ingredients needed for the miracle invoker potion. However, after connecting that ancient city ruins with Amon, a problem was revealed. Klein could already confirm that the upper levels of neighboring pathways also followed the law of beyond a characteristic convergence. Since Amon had been wandering around the forsaken land of the gods for more than 1,000 years and had come near the City of Silver, how could he not be attracted to the Noise ruins in the north? For the chief of the City of Silver to not dare to enter, it means the power in Noise City has definitely reached the level of an angel. Amon wouldn't ignore it. He probably doesn't dare to directly eat such a high level beyond a characteristic of a neighboring pathway, but that doesn't prevent him from setting up a trap. Even if he hadn't done so in the past, he would definitely be rushing over there now. Of course, I can't exclude the possibility that Amon has yet to discover it because, during the City of Silver Chief's first visit, the Noise ruins weren't as dangerous. Perhaps that power at the angel level came to the Noise ruins later. He has been constantly migrating his believers to avoid Amon. Amidst his thoughts, Klein felt a little afraid about heading northwest for the ancient city. He decided to first see if there were any other ways to obtain the main ingredient of the miracle invoker potion before considering if he should head to the periphery of the Noise ruins to observe and gather some intel. With this in mind, he walked towards the wreckage of a tall tower in his black coat and half-top hat, guided by the occasional lightning. Along the way, in the dangerous darkness outside the dim yellow light, monsters lined up and silently followed him. They were already his marionettes. Compared to them, the Saints of the Seer pathway were even more bizarre and terrifying. As they walked, one of the monsters that looked like a fish with limbs suddenly chanted in Jotun, "The sun that is eternal, you are an inextinguishable light, you are the embodiment of order." The moment it finished reciting the three-lined honorific name, the monster collapsed to the ground and lost its life. The honorific name of deities often wasn't limited to 3 lines, but when chanting, one could choose any 3. For example, the Eternal Blazing Sun's complete honorific name was, Eternal Blazing Sun, Inextinguishable Light, Embodiment of Order, God of Contracts, Guardian of Businesses. And just now, Klein had used the first 3. With this method, he prayed to the Lord of Storms, the God of Knowledge and Wisdom, and the Evernite Goddess, hoping to receive a certain response. However, there was no change in his surroundings 15 minutes later. It's useless to pray to a sequence 0 true deity in the forsaken land of the gods. Unless the target is the true creator, or is an existence that wields things like Sephira Castle or the Chaos Sea. That's not right. In Afternoon Town, that clergyman had the goddess's true name concealed when saying it. When he mentioned the 4th king of angels, he suffered immolation due to the involvement of deities. Perhaps it's because there's still all kinds of divine power in the forsaken land of the gods, not only concealment and degeneration. And the true names of the different deities each have special meaning in mysticism, allowing it to stir the corresponding powers. This way, it would explain why the City of Silver has been teaching the 2 true names of Badil and Herebergen, but they didn't end up establishing any connection with the God of Combat or the God of Knowledge and Wisdom. The prayers in the forsaken land of the gods are not heard by the true deities, or even if they can hear them, they are unable to respond. This also means that there are no remnant powers of the God of Combat or the God of Knowledge, otherwise, there would have been certain anomalies. Yes, it's also possible that it's not because there are no anomalies, but that the 2 grade 0 sealed artifacts, God-level sealed artifacts, in the City of Silver have eliminated them. In that case, if I were to directly chant the true name of the goddess, would I cause the surrounding darkness and concealment to stir? If this kind of power can be controlled, I'll have an additional effective trump card when being tracked by Amon. The probability isn't very high. Directly chanting the true name of a deity is an act of blasphemy, and it will result in the corresponding backlash, just like Afternoon Town's clergyman. Based on his logic and the phenomenon he had seen, Klein came up with a theory on the present situation. He was eager to try reading out all the true names of the deities he knew, one by one, and checking their effects. Finally, he restrained himself and didn't blindly make the attempts. I'd better go above the grey fog to do a divination first. Otherwise, who knows if there will be an unbearable accident. Divination involving deities might not give a clear revelation. After muttering inwardly for a while, Klein scoffed at his impulsiveness. My previous plan was akin to, I haven't been courting death for 2 days. I shall do it seriously today. At that moment, he had already arrived at a collapsed tower. He sat beside a wall that had only been cut down by half. He reached out to take out a paper crane from the historical void, and he ignited it. He wanted to see if he could contact the Snake of Fate or Septon Ceres if there was a medium. He wanted to know where he could obtain the main ingredients of the Miracle Invoker potion. Under the illumination of his third summoning of the lantern, Klein fell into a deep sleep, but he didn't dream of anything. Indeed, it doesn't work. After he woke up, Klein shook his head and let his body enter a historical void. Following that, he took 4 steps counterclockwise and arrived above the grey fog. Sitting at the seat belonging to the Fool, he beckoned for a small paper box from the junk pile. Inside was a stack of paper cranes. These were personally folded by a certain baby. At the same time, the world Gehrman Sparrow was conjured. He prayed to Mr. Fool in a greyish-white region and requested him to forward his request to Miss Justice, saying that this act could allow her to make contributions to her exchange for the manipulator potion formula. Of course, Klein had already revealed that the potion needed to be consumed while amidst a huge emotional resonance. Backland, Empress Borough, inside the Hall family's luxurious mansion. Audrey returned to her bedroom once again and set up a bestowment ritual to obtain the paper crane. She picked up a thin pencil and wrote on the paper crane's surface, Dwayne Dantes has requested you to meet with me. After finishing her preparations, Audrey followed Mr. World's instructions and placed the paper crane under her pillow before lying down to sleep. Soon, she saw a pitch-black desolate plain. As a dreamwalker who had given herself hints in advance, she maintained her consciousness and walked towards the black steeple in the middle of the plains with strong curiosity. As soon as she arrived at her destination, Audrey's spiritual perception was triggered. She raised her head and looked at the top of the steeple. At some point in time, there was a giant silver snake coiled there. This gigantic snake didn't have any scales. Its body was covered with symbols and patterns that formed wheels that were connected to each other, with different labels. At that moment, the gigantic snake was staring at Audrey with its bright red and cold eyes. It said in a low voice, "What does Dwayne Dantes want?" "This is the angel of the fate pathway that gave Ma'am Hermit a drop of blood." Audrey controlled her thoughts and calmly looked at the gigantic snake. She said in honesty, "He wanted me to ask you where he can obtain the main ingredient of the Miracle Invoker potion." The gigantic silver snake suddenly fell silent for a few seconds before saying, "The number of sequence 2s in different pathways differ in numbers. Under the situation of the quota of Attendant of Mysteries being filled, there can only be a total of 6 Miracle Invokers. A Miracle Invoker is the name of a sequence 2 potion. Mr. World is going to become an angel. Or is he making preparations for his partner? No, if it's a companion, he can get them to ask him themselves." Audrey was first alarmed before she began to look forward to the mysterious serpent's answer. The gigantic silver snake looked down at Audrey and opened its blood-red mouth. The Sequence 1 potion that Zaratul, the leader of the Secret Order, consumed came from an Attendant of Mysteries. In other words, he possesses an extra Miracle Invoker characteristic. Similarly, it was the same for the ancestor of the Antigonus family back then. Of course, if they were interested in something, or if they had a candidate who had won the favor of the family to the point of them being willing to nurture them, then an angel with sufficiently high status can separate the extra Miracle Invoker beyond a characteristic to the other party. The third Miracle Invoker's beyond a characteristic had combined with a characteristic of mysterious origins. It has become Sealed Artifact 005, also known as the Magic Wishing Lamp. A true deity once attempted to destroy this item, to separate the characteristics and allow them to converge automatically, but eventually failed. The fourth and fifth Miracle Invoker beyond a characteristics are in the form of a Grade 0 sealed artifact that exists in the churches of the Eternal Blazing Sun and Lord of Storms. One of them is named 0 to 13. It comes from the Third Epoch's creator, designated as the Last Banquet. The other is codenamed 0 to 32, a product of the War of the Four Emperors, designated as Theater with Curtains That Never Draw. The sixth Miracle Invoker beyond a characteristic might be in the Forsaken Land of the Gods. During the Third Epoch, there was a remnant dark demonic wolf who occasionally appeared. After the Cataclysm, he vanished without a trace. Audrey listened attentively and thought carefully for a moment before saying, "You're saying that, under the situation where the Attendant of Mysteries spots are filled, there are only 6 miracle invokers. And now, you only mentioned the Secret Order's leader, Zaratul, and the ancestor of the Antigonus family, but the spots don't seem to be filled. In such a situation, there might be an extra miracle invoker beyond a characteristic." This wasn't information that the World Gairman Sparrow had informed her of in advance. Instead, it was a question that Audrey had come up with on her own accord from the details of the answer and her knowledge of mysticism. The eyes of the giant silver snake moved slightly. Indeed, there should be 3 attendants of mysteries. Visit website ourlistnovel.com. But in the Second Epoch, in the era when the ancient god, Phlegraea, still lived, the third set of the attendant of mysteries beyond a characteristic seemed to have disappeared without a trace. No one knows where it is. Likewise for the corresponding miracle invoker beyond a characteristic. Perhaps it has already combined together and has found a sufficiently concealed method to hide itself. Audrey nodded gently and said, "I understand. I'll pass on the information to Mr. Dwayne Dantes. Oh, he even asked me to ask you if there's anything you need his help with." The giant silver snake slithered up and a third of its body stood up. "No. A small matter. Yes, I have a blessed who is an outstanding gourmet. He has a desire to taste ice cream from the various noble families, so as to determine the most delicious one. This request, Mr. Snake, maybe it's Mom Snake, is really nice to her blessed." His tone is as if he can't wait. This is too simple. I can agree to help on Mr. World's behalf and complete it on my own. I'll just treat it as accumulating the sufficient contributions needed to exchange the potion formula." Audrey said thoughtfully, "No problem. But how do I send him the ice cream?" The giant silver snake slowly coiled and said, "Sacrifice it to him. He's already a sequence 3 saint and can accept sacrifices in the same city. His honorific name is, the embodiment of luck, the clairvoyant monster, the calamity that spreads misfortune, the witnesses of all fates in Backland, the keeper of chaos and madness. There's a difference between this honorific name and a normal sequence 3's. There's no name at the end." Audrey's eyes darted around slightly, but she didn't say anything further and nodded in agreement. Keeper of Chaos and Madness. Will's last honorific name is quite interesting. This shouldn't be the honorific name of the Snake of Fate, but something that he used when he was at Sequence 3. Some tweaks were made later on. The monster pathways watches over chaos and madness. Or could it be said that in this world, even for Fate, those at the lower sequences are in chaos and madness? Monsters are working hard to resist all of this, making everything seem normal. After Klein heard Miss Justice's answer, he didn't find it odd for Will Orsepton to request for ice cream. Instead, he found the honorific name of the Life School of Thought president rather interesting. "Hey, having a blessed. That's like saying, I know someone. Did Will learn this from me? No, I have a real blessed, Danitz. Later on, I'll have this fellow sacrifice something for me to eat. I can't really eat those mutated monsters or summon projections from the historical void, right? Yes, if I have a chance, I'll invite little son to try them together. I can't let him be obsessed with Frank's mushrooms. The number of blessed serving will definitely won't be less than mine. There might even be more. He has the huge life school of thought." Klein conjured the World Gairman Sparrow and made him reply to Miss Justice, indicating that the ice cream contributed plenty. After completing all of this, he rapped the edge of the long mottled table and seriously considered the problem with the main ingredient of the miracle invoker. There's no need to think about the miracle invoker beyond a characteristic with Zaratul. It's impossible for him to separate it to give it to me. He only wants to turn me into his marionette. It's not like there's zero hope with Antigonus's 2 portions, but if that's the case, I'll have to request it from the goddess again. I can't offer something equivalent, I'm afraid. Besides, the goddess might not be able to provide it. The reason why she wants to seal the half-fool, who has lost control, is probably because she is unable to kill him. Once he is killed, he will be able to escape his current predicament and revive elsewhere, just like how I escaped from Aemon. Under such a situation, the goddess has no way of getting Antigonus to separate a miracle invoker beyond a characteristic. Even a true deity can't shatter 005, so there's no point targeting it. It's useless even if I have it. This sealed artifact's origins are truly mysterious. There's something very fishy about it. The Church of the Eternal Blazing Suns 0 to 13 is called the Last Banquet. It comes from the City of Silver's creator. Why does this person always like to use the names that have dangerous implications? The Church of the Lord of Storms' 0 to 32 is theater with curtains that never draw. Just the sound of it allows me to imagine what it's like. The chances of obtaining these 2 grade 0 sealed artifacts are very low, but it's not impossible. It just depends on whether the Eternal Blazing Sun and Lord of Storms are willing to support my growth so as to contain Aemon. Yes. Up to now, they have yet to show any kindness. I can't find a suitable way to interact with the right person. I can't possibly use divination to spy on the Eternal Blazing Sun again and communicate with him through space, right? If that happens, wouldn't it be better if he directly invades Sephira Castle and takes control of this place? If I were to nurture Mr. Hanged Man and wait till he has the qualifications to come into contact with a grade 0 sealed artifact, I'll most likely have become Aemon. The true creator knows a clue to the third characteristic of the Attendant of Mysteries. His divine kingdom and holy residence are in the forsaken land of the gods. These two might be related somehow. The 2 sets of miracle invoker characteristics and an Attendant of Mysteries characteristics are highly likely to be in the forsaken land of the gods. I wonder which one is in the Noise ruins. Yes, the true creator should only know a clue, and not its exact location. Otherwise, he would have obtained that Attendant of Mysteries beyond a characteristic before the War of the 4 Emperors and effectively increased his subordinate strength. In other words, the Attendant of Mysteries beyond a characteristic is something even a true deity can't obtain quickly, and it's necessary to search for it. It might not be so easy for Aemon to come across it, allowing him to set up a trap. If the danger within the ruins were only recently found, having just been transplanted, it would match this trait. From the looks of it, I still have to make a trip. However, I have to be careful enough. The danger comes from Aemon and also from the ruins. I'll do a divination first, then I'll observe and gather intelligence from a distance. I won't enter blindly and will be patient enough. Klein conjured a pen and paper and was about to write the corresponding divination statement when he suddenly thought of something and decided to make another confirmation. He drew a complicated symbol that was a mixture of concealment and mystery prying. He threw it into the crimson star representing the magician. With Gairman Sparrow's image and tone, he asked her to question a Rhodes. Backland, Eastborough. Fors, who was about to move houses, drew the curtains and lit a candle. She set up a mirror and found Zio to act as a bystander. She then drew the symbol that Mr. World had given her. In the room, the environment gradually turned dark as cold winds stirred, causing the two to tremble. The surface of the mirror suddenly rippled, forming ancient dark red Phasak text. You have summoned the great Erodes. You have to abide by the corresponding rules. You have to answer a question for every question asked. If you lie or refuse to answer, you will be punished. All right, Fors, who had been warned, calmly replied. Following that, she asked curiously, where can one obtain the main ingredient of the miracle invoker potion? On the surface of the mirror, dark red words appeared one after another as other lines vanished. They answered the question in detail. It's basically the same as Will's answer. Above the grey fog, through the crimson star representing Miss Magician, Klein watched the specific process and nodded in disappointment. After Fors memorized the answer, she said nervously, "It's your turn to ask." The dark red words changed and formed a new sentence. Have you had an erotic dream in the past year? Phew. Thankfully, it's still okay. Fors heaved a sigh of relief and said, yes. This was human nature. She didn't feel that there was anything to be ashamed of. Following that, she raised the second question. Do you have any suggestions on the matter regarding obtaining the main ingredient of the miracle invoker? Erodes dispersed the dark red text and used silver colors to form new words. The Abraham family still holds the Apprentice Pathways Sequence 2 Planeswalker Potion formula, as well as the corresponding powerful sealed artifacts. A total of 2 of them. The Aurora Order also has one. This, Klein's eyes lit up as he thought of a new possibility. Is that so? Fors frowned slightly and said, it's your turn to ask a question. The silver color on the surface of the mirror faded away as dark red colors formed a sentence. Other than you, who else was the star of your erotic dream? Fors gaped as her face flushed red. At that moment, Fors felt her cheeks burning as she stiffened. She didn't even dare to turn her head to look at her friend. She realized that she had severely underestimated the bottom line of the magic mirror. After stuttering for a moment, Fors recalled Mr. World's reminder and closed her eyes. I choose to accept the punishment. A silvery white bolt of lightning fell from the air in the room, but the moment it appeared, the lightning vanished without a trace like it was a hallucination. The dark red words on the surface of the mirror were dyed silver as they were quickly replaced with new content. The question and answer game will end here today. Goodbye. Without waiting for Force to open her eyes and before Zio could react, the rippling light in the mirror instantly calmed down. The gloom and darkness in the room shattered as they were swallowed by the light of the candle. Wasn't there supposed to be a punishment? Force waited for a few seconds before opening her eyes slightly. She looked at the mirror that had returned to normal and then at Zio, who was watching by the sidelines. Zio pointed at the top of her head and said, "There was lightning that smote at you, but it disappeared halfway. Also, the magic mirror had already left. The magic mirror was only joking. That's not right. The warning I received was that the questions would be rather embarrassing, and the punishments would be rather heavy. Could it be that Mr. Fool protected me?" Force rubbed her right cheek as she made a guess. Perhaps. Zio nodded in agreement with her friend. Just as Force heaved a sigh of relief and rejoiced, she suddenly realized that Zio was looking at her earnestly. What's the matter? Force's heart skipped a beat. Zio asked thoughtfully, "In that erotic dream of yours, who was the main lead?" Haha, who would remember such a dream from so long ago? Besides, aren't dreams blurry and unclear? Force forced a smile. Zio tersely acknowledged. "If that's the case, why didn't you answer with that just now?" "I was nervous. I was too nervous." Force glanced at the luggage that she had finished packing and said, "It's time for us to move. I miss having a fireplace." As she spoke, she walked towards her luggage. It was only at this moment that she realized that, at times, the outcome was similar whether she answered the magic mirror's question or not. Is this the social death that was mentioned by Gairman Sparrow? I really want to bury my head into the ground. Force continuously took deep breaths in an attempt to calm her burning face and embarrassed heart. In the ancient palace above the fog, Klein threw the sea god scepter back into the junk pile and scoffed at Rhodes's act. Despite knowing that I was the one who sent someone to summon it, it actually dared to raise such a question. Only when I stopped the punishment did it hurriedly change its attitude and leave in a panic. It sure had fun. However, its answer has given me a new train of thought. I really don't need to restrict myself to the path of a miracle invoker. The second blasphemy slate is most likely from the City of Silver's creator, and is now in the hands of Adam. Although Aemon and his brother are mutually staying away from each other's affairs and aren't on especially good terms, they have worked together before. I don't believe that he has never seen that blasphemy slate. If that's the case, he is definitely aware of the miracle invoker's ritual and can guess that I'll be bringing the City of Silver out of the forsaken land of the gods. When that happens, he wouldn't even need to put much effort into tracking me. He just needs to wait at the Giant King's court. Yes, I can't go according to the enemy's expectations, especially since this is a god of deceit and the god of mischief. Countless accidents will happen. If it's because of my participation that the City of Silver's thousands of years of hope ends up being destroyed, then it'll be completely contradictory to my original intentions. The problem with a planeswalker is that I might hear Mr. Door's ravings, and will suffer the scrutiny and corruption from the cosmos that's worse than Sequence 2 angels from other pathways. Of course, this isn't completely unacceptable. Also, will I need to pay back the 2 resurrection chances that Sephira Castle gave me? That's still fine since I'll definitely transfer back to being an attendant of mysteries at Sequence 1 because Mr. Door has already blocked off the advancement path of the apprentice pathway. He is at least in control of the uniqueness and 2 sets of Sequence 1 beyonder characteristics, perhaps even all 3. It's not necessary for me to switch to Planeswalker, but I have to make the necessary preparations. When my options increase, even if Aemon tries to stop me, the difficulty of burying a trap in advance will increase significantly. Only then can I become an angel while under the pressure of a king of angels. Yes, I'll stay on the fence for now. I'll prepare for the Miracle Invoker advancement while preparing for the Planeswalker advancement. I'll determine which pathway to take based on the actual situation when the time comes. Having come to a decision, Klein felt refreshed. His mind was abnormally active, and he quickly came up with a preliminary plan. I'm not in a hurry to ask Miss Magician's teacher about the Planeswalker potion formula and the corresponding Grade 0 sealed artifact. This will scare the Abraham family, making them suspect that Miss Magician worships some evil god and has joined some terrible organization. With the current situation, there's a high chance that they won't reply. They will change their identities, move, and sever all ties. Yes, the head of the Saint of Secrets, Botus, will make a fine gift. Regardless of whether the Abraham family gives the worm of Cosmos, this matter will have to be placed on the agenda. I hope Miss Justice can digest the Dreamwalker potion as soon as possible. I hope that Ma'am Hermit will be prepared. I also hope that the two ladies, Miss Magician and Miss Judgment, will be able to improve before the operation. Right, according to what Miss Magician said, Saint of Secrets Botus is a defector of the Abraham family, and the Aurora Order holds a Grade 0 sealed artifact of the Apprentice Pathway. That's interesting. Perhaps I don't need to contact the Abraham family. I might be able to get what I want from the Saint of Secrets. I have to remind Ma'am Hermit that Botus might be carrying a Grade 0 sealed artifact, so confirmation has to be made before the operation. If that Grade 0 sealed artifact isn't in the hands of the Saint of Secrets, then I'll probably have to face the Angel of Fate Ouroboros to get it. No, Grade 0 sealed artifacts are terrifying to begin with. It's one of the sources of danger. Phew, I'll first wait for Miss Magician's teacher to reply and see if the Abraham family is averse to any mention of the Worm of Cosmos. As he thought of this, Klein suddenly felt a hint of self-deprecation. He felt that he and the Aurora Order appeared to be destined enemies. They often had all kinds of interactions. When the operation begins, the Aurora Order will definitely shout in their hearts, "Why is it you again? Why is it us again?" After letting out a breath, he gathered his thoughts and conjured the world Gehrman Sparrow. He replied to Miss Magician, who had reported the answer. Following that, the world prayed once again, requesting Mr. Fool to forward his request to Danitz. On a certain island in the Fog Sea, Danitz, who was waiting for the Golden Dream, turned his head to look at Anderson and chuckled. "I'm going to summon Gehrman Sparrow's messenger." Anderson pricked up his brows and scoffed. "You're qualified to consume the Conspirer potion. You were the one who made it too obvious. Even I could sense that you were afraid of that messenger." Danitz felt even more pleased with himself as he said humbly. Anderson suddenly guffawed. "Why do you not suspect that I'm pretending to be afraid? I'm just trying to find a reasonable excuse to avoid hearing things I shouldn't be hearing. Doggish T, do you think I'll believe the lies you came up with in a hurry?" Danitz was almost convinced. Anderson spread his hands and walked to the door. "You've gathered all the materials of the Conspirer potion. Remember to remind Gehrman to not forget my Iron-Blooded Knight potion formula." Danitz waved his hand impatiently, indicating that he hadn't forgotten. After Anderson walked out of the room and closed the door, Danitz immediately set up a ritual and summoned the messenger holding 4 blonde, red-eyed heads. Seeing the 8 eyes look over at the same time, Danitz's chest immediately retracted. He forced a smile and handed out a gold coin. "Ma'am, Gehrman Sparrow wants me to tell you that he's fine. He's now in the Forsaken Land of the Gods." Wait, what did I say? The Forsaken Land of the Gods. As a crew member of Vice Admiral Iceberg, Danitz's knowledge of mysticism was still adequate. After a momentary pause, his pupils clearly dilated. "All right," Rionette Tinica bit down on the gold coin and answered immediately. Then, she entered the void and vanished from the room. After reporting this to Gehrman Sparrow, Danitz received the Iron-Blooded Knight's potion formula and new orders. Prepare some local delicacies and sacrifice them to Sea God Carvatur. Isn't this mission a little odd? Danitz muttered to himself, but he didn't dare to raise any questions. He quickly tidied up the altar, found a parchment, and wrote down the supplementary ingredients and corresponding ritual in the Iron-Blooded Knight potion formula. Following that, he opened the door and handed the parchment to Anderson. Form a team of at least 30 people. The stronger the team's strength and chemistry, the better the ritual's effects. Anderson unfolded the parchment in front of Danitz and read it. As he read, his brows gradually furrowed. If the team's chemistry is to build upon the idea of killing me, the captain, the ritual is rather simple. Without waiting for Danitz to mock him, a burning white flame appeared from his fingertip and burned the parchment. Anderson chuckled. "I need to go back to my homeland to find an opportunity. That place is currently being invaded by Phynopotter, and war is always the best place for building up and training a team." With a pause, he looked at Danitz and said with a smile, "I've prepared some questions for you. They're in my room. Once you become a conspirer, you can try doing it and see if your intelligence has improved." Doggish T. Are you trying to trick me into reading all the books in your room? Danitz was almost moved, but he immediately understood that something was wrong. No matter how high his intelligence was, he wouldn't be able to solve the questions if he hadn't read the textbooks. Not bad. It only took you 3 seconds this time to grasp the crux of the matter. If it were in the past, hey, you would have really believed me. Anderson praised with a smile as he turned around and left the inn. In the forsaken land of the gods, at night when the frequency of lightning had dropped to a very low frequency. 2 slices of white bread and a piece of barbecued meat is pretty good after all. The sweet and sour desserts from the Fog Sea are better than I had expected. After swallowing the last mouthful of food, Klein sighed in amazement from the bottom of his heart. He then threw the remaining packaging into the darkness. After all, there was no concept of environmental protection here, nor was there a rubbish bin. Of course, he had removed his connection with those items ahead of time, just like how he would head over to Sephira Castle to perform sterilization every time he abandoned a marionette. This was to prevent Aemon's avatars from locking onto him with them. Lifeless objects won't be transferred into a concealed state by the darkness here. Klein raised the lantern that Danitz had sacrificed, and he illuminated the abandoned items. It was only after he filled his stomach that he was in the mood to try out the dangerous things he had previously divined. Amidst the flickering dim yellow light, Klein reached his right hand out into the air and dragged out another projection of himself. It was another version of him from the historical void, one who was also holding onto a lantern. Klein entered the grayish-white fog 1 second later, allowing his projection's consciousness to awaken. The projection was surrounded by a group of monsters. Amidst the endless darkness, it opened its mouth, planning to recite the name, Ammonizers. Quote ellipsis quote. He didn't manage to make a single sound, as though the words he wanted to say had been concealed. Indeed, it's as I expected. Wearing a silk half-top hat and a black trench coat, Klein slowly took a deep breath. Looking at the lantern that emitted faint yellow light, he suddenly chanted in Jotun, Leodero. Before he could finish his sentence, more than 100 lightning bolts warped as if they were responding to being summoned. They instantly blanketed the area. There was no time for him to dodge. Even if he had switched places with a marionette, he would still be within the attack range. Amidst the brightening of silvery white light, he collapsed to the ground. His body was charred as he convulsed violently, as though he had become a gigantic piece of coal. Then, his figure rapidly dissipated as the illusion vanished. Wearing a real top hat, clothed in an Intis-styled windbreaker and carrying a simple lantern, Klein immediately returned to reality and continued proceeding forward as if nothing had happened. After walking for a while, his figure suddenly turned blurry and clear. Following that, Klein opened his mouth again and read out a name in Jotun. Just as he produced the first syllable, a transparent flame burst out from his body, instantly reducing him to ashes, not giving him a chance to switch places with his marionette. Klein's figure appeared once again. He pressed his hat and walked calmly on the hill filled with strange plants. Herabergen. Ellipsis. Badial. Ellipsis. Omabella. There's nothing out of the ordinary. There are no traces of the corresponding divine powers left in the vicinity of the City of Silver. Medici, Ouroboros, Sasria. These are of no use, neither one of them are deities. I thought that the situation at Afternoon Town and the Giant King's Court was due to special circumstances. Using Sasria's true name outside can activate the powers of degeneration from the forsaken land of the gods. As a king of angels with the uniqueness, Red Angel is also considered half a true god. Yet, there aren't any traces left of him. How shameful for a person, no, shameful for a king of angels. As Klein walked down the hill, he followed his spiritual intuition and headed northwest where the city ruins of Noise were. He would occasionally take a detour, occasionally using Flaming Jump, and he didn't follow the route that the City of Silver had used to explore to reach the destination. Backland, late at night. Feeling that she had digested the potion a little more, Audrey very eagerly used dream traversal to leave her mansion and to enter the various dreams of the surrounding area. Knowing what the current situation was like, she had a strong desire to become a demigod. Just like that, she suddenly saw someone familiar. This was a noble lady who had a good relationship with her. She was 29 years old and had married a viscount 2 years ago. At this moment, the lady's room was filled with rose petals. The bed was white, and there was a heart-shaped ring placed on it. And she could hear knocking sounds from the outside. With flushed cheeks, the lady quickly walked over and opened the window. A man wearing a black iron mask and a dark cloak leaped in. He hugged the lady and whispered, "I'll take you away from your suffering." Then, the two of them started to wrap their bodies around one another as they rolled into bed. As a dreamwalker who was working hard to digest the potion, Audrey had long seen similar scenes. She had experienced the phase of feeling embarrassed, and she sighed at how everyone's dreams were full of imagination. At that moment, she didn't lose her composure at all. She maintained the etiquette of a spectator, as though she was witnessing an overly intense play. After a brief examination, she discovered a problem. The man wearing the black iron mask wasn't the wife's spouse, but more like a particular playboy in the aristocratic circles. Is this a reflection of what's hidden in her heart? Audrey muttered to herself in an academic manner while analyzing the dream. Following that, she traversed into the dream beside her out of curiosity. This dream corresponded to the noble wife's husband, the Viscount. In the dream, this Viscount was busy attending a discussion at the House of Lords. Later, he was chased by an earl with a revolver. The latter claimed that he had tricked his daughter. After escaping to a safe zone, the Viscount found his female secretary to vent his fear. Audrey couldn't help but leave the dream, wanting to see the state the Viscount and his wife were in. In the bedroom under the illumination of the crimson moonlight, the Viscount was hugging his wife on the huge white bed. His wife was hugging him and sleeping in a very intimate manner. Yes, I have to realize that everyone has a dark side to them. It's just a dream that they've had. If conviction, for a mere instantaneous thought, was carried out, then everyone would descend into hell, and no one will be spared, including myself. I can control my dark side, preventing it from ever being realized in the real world. To most people, that's already considered excellent. Audrey increasingly felt that acting as a dreamwalker was a way to question and hone one's mind and body. She entered the dreamscape again and traversed to another area. Not long after, she arrived at a warm room. There was a dining table placed over a thick carpet. At the seat of honor was a white-haired old lady. To her sides were a middle-aged couple and 3 children who were not of age. They were all enjoying the delicious food, chatting and laughing. It was dark outside the room. The strong winds made the glass groan and thump as they seemed to brew a horrifying sensation before the disaster struck. What is the owner of this dream bothered about? Audrey retreated from the dream and tried to find an answer from the real world to verify her hypothesis. She then saw a small bed and the white-haired old lady. There were photo frames on the bedside table of the old lady. They were either wrapped in black cloth or white flowers, consisting of a middle-aged couple and 3 underage children. Audrey silently turned her head to look out the window, only to see that there were ruins nearby, ones left behind by an explosion. The young noble lady pursed her lips and suddenly returned to the old lady's dreams. She didn't stop the disaster that might happen. She only conjured a chair and sat on it. She looked at the happy and warm family in a solemn manner. Amidst the howling wind and glass, the room was brightly lit. There was the fragrance of food and laughter everywhere. Audrey had already concluded one of the acting principles of Dreamwalker: a traveler of a dream enters, takes in the sights, and records, never interfering. That was a spectator. Ellipsis. In St. Samuel Cathedral, having been summoned by Bishop Anthony Stephen, Leonard slowly walked up the spiral staircase under the sunlight that shone in through the stained glass. Suddenly, he said with a suppressed voice, "Old man, that secret gathering is about to begin again. Are you really planning to attempt to enter the treasures left behind by the Jacob family at the end of the month? I'm not sure yet, but this is an opportunity. At the very least, Aemon's main body is being tied down by the matter regarding Sephira Castle. He won't suddenly appear." In Leonard's mind, Palais Zoroast replied with a slightly hoarse voice, "However, I'm more inclined to reveal the news of the treasure trove. I want the people at the gathering to adventure and explore it. We'll stay in the vicinity and observe the situation, taking what I need from their hands." Leonard was taken aback as he whispered, "Old man, isn't that too sinister?" This was using the members of the Hermits of Fate as tools to step into a trap. Hey, naive, childish. You can tell them all the details and let them decide whether they want to go on their own. Palais scoffed. Leonard didn't mention it again. Instead, he asked, "Old man, when can I become a demigod?" Palais chuckled. "If you can obtain a spirit at the level of your former colleague's messenger, you'll be able to digest the potion by the beginning of next year. However, hey, it's better to act according to my instructions. Engage in a deeper level of acting. Wait till the second half of next year, you'll have the qualifications to try for Sequence 4. Of course, I'm not sure if the Church of Evernite will give you the potion and hold a ritual for you." That high-ranking deacon named Sesamir Crestet had to wait several years before he truly became a demigod when war truly broke out, didn't he? Leonard nodded and asked thoughtfully, "Old man, can you act as a spirit to help me digest the potion?" Your level should be higher than Klein's messenger. Palais Zoroast fell silent for a few seconds before he chortled. What a great idea. How about I help you digest the potion? How? Leonard knew that old man was mocking him, but he couldn't help but ask. I'll deeply parasitize you, gaining full control over your body, Palais snapped back. As he spoke, Leonard came to the door of the Backland Diocese's archbishop. He immediately shut his mouth and raised his right hand to knock on the door. Come in. Anthony Stephen glanced at Leonard, who had opened the door. You can release that vampire behind Cheney's gate.